Chapter 7:22. I don't have any suggestions, but I do have a few explanations. Zhou Tong gasped for breath with some difficulty. These explanations are meaningless to others, but I think that you are different. After all, in these last few years, the two of us were in similar situations. My so-called betrayal stemmed from fear and self-preservation, while you, for the same reason, did many similar things. This was referring to how you had hidden from the Divine Empress and listened to the Pope's original intentions, secretly arranging for Chen Chongqing to enter the Orthodox Academy. You shook her head. My fear and self-preservation stemmed from the world after the Empress. It has nothing to do with the Empress. No matter what you say, in my view, since the Empress has never cared about our lives, why must we live for her? On that night, Chen Chongqing went to the alley of the Northern Military Department to kill me. I almost died, but what did the Empress do? Zhou Tong jeered. She completely ignored my situation, only thinking about how to recognize her son. Alas, she was blind and even recognized the wrong son. As he sneered, his purple-black gums contrasted with his pale face, making for a very unsightly sight. Mou somewhat proudly said, "The Empress cared about me, so she had me and Yorong leave the capital first." Zhou Tong was quiet for a very long time, then suddenly said, "Did you really think that just because I was poisoned you could easily kill me?" Mou did not explain, only stated, "I will kill you. You have the greatest problem. You're too young." Zhou Tong continued, "Being young means that you haven't lived long enough. No matter how high your talent is, your cultivation can't be too high. Moreover, you don't have much patience. You should have appeared a little later, allowing my poison to flare up a little deeper. In addition, you shouldn't have chosen this place. This is my home. Killing someone in their home is always a rather difficult task. To the vast majority of people in the world, home was the place they were most familiar with, the final fortress, the true home field. Zhou Tong had hidden his most cherished tranquility and treasures in this small courtyard, so he had naturally made many corresponding arrangements. There were many mechanisms and arrays in this place. With his words, the sounds of many mechanisms activating could be heard from outside the window. The sunlight in the courtyard seemed to dim as several powerful array intents rose from the ground. The two precious pills had already been converted into essence in his stomach. They flowed through his meridians throughout his body, temporarily suppressing the invasion of the poison and restoring part of his strength. The sun in the sky did not have any real temperature, and the gentle breeze was a little cold. A bloody smell enveloped the entire courtyard along with the array. Without hesitation, he used the secret art of the Great Crimson Gown. If someone used their spiritual sense to observe, they would discover that the entire courtyard had been soaked in a sea of blood. The Great Crimson Gown secret art was his strongest technique, and it consumed an extremely large amount of spiritual sense and true essence. This was especially true now that he had been poisoned by two different poisons, so he had no way of maintaining it for too long. However, Mou couldn't stay in this sea of blood. If she didn't want to perish together with him, she had to temporarily retreat. He only needed to take advantage of her temporary retreat to escape from this small courtyard. As long as he reached the street, he would be able to save his own life. This was the most effective method Zhou Tong could think of before he died. The small courtyard looked very ordinary, but there were many important people living on the street outside the courtyard. Back then, he had chosen this place because of this consideration. What happened next surpassed Zhou Tong's imagination. To put it more accurately, it surpassed his understanding and understanding of Mou. Because Mou did not leave. She stood by the door, allowing the invisible sea of blood to smear her palace dress with terrifying colors. She was very calm, very focused. The exhaustion on her face had already been completely replaced by a deathly stillness. The palace dress glittered with starlight, shining through the blood. It was a very beautiful sight. A slender sword that seemed very delicate, but contained within it was the wind and rain of time. It pierced through the sea of blood in the room, like a condensed ray of starlight. With a squelch, the delicate sword sank into Zhou Tong's abdomen. The tip of the sword protruded from his waist, bringing with it a stream of black blood. Zhou Tong did not scream, did not howl in pain. He stared in a daze at her in front of him, his face brimming with disbelief. Mou's sword had pierced through his body. His sea of blood had also swallowed Mou's spiritual sense. Let alone the fact that Mou was only at the middle level of star condensation, even if she broke into the peak of star condensation, she would still be unable to leave this sea of blood, this small courtyard. In other words, her death was assured. Why? Zhou Tong quickly understood that she had never thought of living on in the first place. He had wanted to use the words mutual destruction to force her to retreat, but she had originally come to die with him. Her return to the capital had always been a path to death. She only wanted to bring him with her. Whether she fell into the abyss or entered the sea of stars, she wanted to bring him with her, to bring him before the divine empress. Zhou Tong's face became very pale. He did not want to die with her. The entire small courtyard was still under his control, and there were still mechanisms and arrays that had not been activated. He still wanted to gamble. However, he did not succeed, not because of the sword piercing through his body, but because his body had stiffened. A pair of hands fell on his shoulders. These hands were very thin, very withered, like tree branches, very white, as if they had not seen the sun for many days. The nails were very sharp, very long, very sharp, and covered in mud. These were 2 wolf claws. The sharp nails had sunk deeply into Zhou Tong's shoulder bones, piercing several bloody holes from which black blood gurgled. Zhou Tong knew that his injuries were even more severe. Cracks had already appeared on his shoulder bones. His body felt incomparably cold and abnormally terrified. He did not dare to turn his head to look. He had already guessed who that ghost-like person was that had silently appeared behind him. Back then, he had seen the dossier on this person's murders on the snowy plains. He knew that if he turned his head, his neck would definitely be bitten through. On the brink of life and death, Zhou Tong no longer cared about the 2 poisons in his body. He squeezed out even the last drop of true essence. In the room enveloped in a sea of blood, a massive wave rose up to the heavens. With a howl, he transformed into a bloody light and charged out the door. With a cracking sound, the elegant sword that had pierced through his body was actually broken by the momentum of his forward charge. The person who appeared behind him like a ghost didn't even have time to twist his neck. There were only a few sounds and several spurts of blood. Countless mechanisms were activated at the same time. Several array intents displayed their final effects, exploding like fireworks. The fake mountains and screen walls of the small courtyard all collapsed, followed closely by the house itself. Dust filled the air, the bamboo snapped into several pieces, the stone slabs shattered, and even the sunlight seemed to shatter. Zhou Tong fell by the broken bamboo by the wall. He used his fastest speed to push away a fake bamboo shoot, and the remaining walls of the courtyard all collapsed. He was blasted out of the courtyard by the wave of qi and landed heavily on the snowy ground. His body was covered in blood amidst the pure white snow. This scene was not beautiful, nor did it make one feel heroic. His blood was black and suffused with a foul stench. It flowed from the sword wound on his chest. His back was even more wretched. His clothes were in tatters and his flesh was badly mangled. 10 claw marks were so deep that white bone could be faintly seen. Zhou Tong had lived for many years, but this was his most miserable moment. But in his eyes that were filled with fear and pain, he finally saw some hope, even wild joy. Because he had finally arrived on the street. Dust filled the air and stone fragments madly danced. In a very short time, the entire small courtyard had become ruins. Mou was not surprised by this. She knew that a person like Zhou Tong, on the verge of death, would assuredly cause a great disturbance. Moreover, this truly was his home ground. She was somewhat surprised that someone had actually followed Zhou Tong out of the tunnels. Even though she had a detailed map of the tunnels of Zhou prison, she had never thought about going down. But when she realized that it was Zheshio, the unexpected became a logical conclusion. She knew that this wolf cub was most skilled at tracking and hiding, and then killing. She and Zheshio glanced at each other, then walked out of the courtyard. He was injured, but not too seriously. Zhou Tong's cultivation was far higher than Mou's and Zheshio's. Under normal circumstances, even if Mou and Zheshio worked together, they would not necessarily be a match for him. Mou and Zheshio were the people in the world who wanted him dead the most. They had made ample preparations and had chosen to use poison at the same time. Even in these circumstances, Zhou Tong had still survived and escaped from the small courtyard. However, Mou and Zheshio were not worried, because Zhou Tong only had half a life left and was not far from death. When they walked onto the street, Zhou Tong was still not far ahead. Zhou Tong had already become a man of blood. Let alone using a swift technique, he could not even walk very fast. He staggered forward. Blood incessantly dripped onto the snow. Its color was very dark, just like ink. Zheshio had disappeared to some unknown place, and the shadows along the street seemed somewhat distorted. Mou arrived behind him, her black hair slightly disheveled, lightly brushing against her pale face. She said nothing, expressionlessly gazing at his back. She had returned to the capital to prepare to perish together with Zhou Tong. He had not expected that she would still be alive. She did not care if others discovered that she had returned to the capital, did not care if others saw her. Zhou Tong knew that she had come. He strove to walk faster, but he could not. The snowy street was very quiet. The only thing that could be heard was his heavy breathing. Mou gripped her broken sword and chopped down. With a paw, Zhou Tong heavily fell onto the snowy ground, a bloody wound appearing on his left rib. He still did not turn his head. Gasping for breath, he struggled to his feet and continued forward. There was an estate on the side of the street. Its gate was vermilion, and a rather damaged white banner stretched out from the corner of the wall. With a creak, the gate of the estate was pushed open, and someone walked out. Zhou Tong knew who this estate belonged to. His blood-stained face showed no change in emotion as he continued forward. A sword glow flashed once more, and another wound appeared on his body. Then, he fell once more into the snow. A cry of alarm came from the stone step. Zhou Tong lay in the snow, painfully coughing, blood constantly splashing into the air. After some time, with a low howl like that of a wild beast, he once more stood up from the snow. Mou was right behind him, her hand gripping her sword. Her sword was stained with his blood. He did not turn his head, only looked forward, his rapid and painful gasps for breath. The snowy street was so clear and spacious. As far as the eye could see, there was not a single person. Where was he going? Chapter 7:23. There was a long street in the northern part of the capital called the Road of Peace. This place was not far from the imperial city, and after crossing the nearby Sanchi Bridge, one could reach the Vermilion Bird Avenue, making it very convenient to go to court. For countless years, this street had been inhabited by high officials and nobles. From the previous dynasty until now, nothing had changed. It was just that as the situation changed, the people living in the courtyards on the side of the street constantly changed. In the era of the Orthodox dynasty, the large courtyard with the best position on the Road of Peace, the one closest to the imperial city, naturally belonged to the Tianhai clan. After the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, the Tianhai clan had not changed much, but several miles to the east, many courtyards had changed owners and were undergoing major renovations. This was because the Prince of Xiang, the Prince of Zhongshan, and 10 some other princes had already moved in. The easternmost courtyard on the Road of Peace, the one closest to the scholar trees, was the Shui estate. As the Tianhai Divine Empress's most trusted #1 person in the Great Zhou army, Xue Xingchuan naturally had the right to enjoy this sort of treatment. The Xue clan naturally could not continue to protect this courtyard. The new owner might be some prince or some divine general, but who knew? Madame Xue also did not know who the new owner of this courtyard was, but she knew that this was unavoidable. She had never had any extravagant hopes of continuing to live here, so she had long since made the appropriate preparations. She dismissed all the servants, and after the ceremony was over, she used the silver from her dowry to buy a small courtyard on the street outside 100 Flowers Lane. After doing all this, she originally believed that she could calm down, but when she heard the weeping at her side, she realized that peace was still an extravagant hope. She felt her head begin to ache and she harshly asked, "Are you crying because you're in pain, or because you're crying because you're sad?" The young lady of the Xue clan who had been driven out of the assistant minister's estate had remained in the Xue estate the entire time, washing her face in tears. Today, when she heard the news, she cried even more. Madame Xue's question frightened her. Timidly raising her head, she asked, sobbing, "Mother, what's wrong?" Her eyes had long since turned red and her voice had become somewhat hoarse. For some reason, her face was covered in wounds as if she had been beaten. Madame Xue pointed at the bruises on her face that had still not disappeared and angrily said, "If you're crying because you're in pain from being beaten, then that means you're useless and unworthy of being your father's daughter. If you're crying because he's dead, then that means there's something wrong with your head. Is it worth it to cry for this sort of person?" The news that Assistant Minister Wei of the Ministry of Rights had been killed by Qin Chongxing and Wang Pe had already spread throughout the entire capital. Every time Miss Xue thought of her husband's ruthlessness, she would be extremely angry, wishing for nothing more than for him to die. But when she suddenly found out that the man was really dead, thinking about all these years, she couldn't help but feel sad, feeling that her life was really bitter. Listening to her mother's words, the eldest daughter of the Xue family also felt that she was really useless, but why did President Chen kill him? Shouldn't he have beaten that man up and brought him to the Xue mansion to apologize to him? Swearing to the heavens that he would treat him very, very well in the future, just like before, an unexpected howl interrupted her messy thoughts. The howl came from the courtyard next to the Xue residence. Soon after, there was the rumbling of countless collisions, and one could faintly hear the rumbling of wind and thunder. Then, the house collapsed and dust filled the air. The eldest daughter of the Xue clan was stupefied. Her face was pale, and she no longer had the mind to grieve or weep. Madame Xue's gaze fell on the dust rising from the neighboring courtyard, a look of doubt on her face. The collapse of the neighboring courtyard had not affected the Xue estate, but for some reason, she felt that it had something to do with the Xue estate. Many years ago, when the Divine Empress bestowed this residence on the Road of Peace to Xue Xingchuan, the courtyard that was one wall away also began to undergo renovations. The gate to this courtyard opened in the south among the scholar trees. Normal people wouldn't even be able to discover it, and if one walked along the Road of Peace, they would only feel that this courtyard was a part of the Xue estate. The owner of this courtyard was very mysterious and never interacted with others. Even today, Madame Xue did not know who he was. She could only vaguely guess that it was related to her clan, because she had personally heard Xue Xingchuan make 2 corresponding arrangements and give the most severe warnings. She had even once suspected that this mysterious neighbor might be the rumored crown prince Xiaoming. Of course, later on, it was proven that this conjecture was wrong. The collapse of the house brought up countless clouds of dust. The broken bamboo was like a broken bough, breaking into pieces of emerald green bamboo that fell into the garden of the Xue estate. Madame Xue hugged her frightened daughter and softly comforted her. The neighboring courtyard was still collapsing, rumbling incessantly as if someone had fallen from the courtyard onto the street. Madame Xue did not know why the neighboring courtyard had collapsed, but seeing this terrifying disturbance, she thought to herself that even if that person managed to escape, he would probably be injured. She ordered the steward to open the door and see if that person needed help. The sky was approaching dusk and somewhat gloomy. Fortunately, the snow on the street was still so white, so one could clearly see that blood-covered person, even though that person's blood seemed to be black. When the steward pushed open the door to the Shui estate, the first scene that Madame Shui and her daughter saw was this gory scene. The young lady of the Shui clan cried out in alarm, repeatedly yelling, "Quickly come and save him!" After saying this, she saw a very strange scene. A beauty in a palace dress appeared behind the bloody man without a sound. The body of this beauty was also bleeding and covered in dust. It somewhat obscured her face, but it could not obscure her beauty. Who was she? What was going on here? Just when the young lady of the Shui clan was in a daze, the beauty raised the broken sword in her hand and slashed at the bloody person. A spurt of blood shot into the snow. It was not much, not enough to kill the bloody person on the spot, but not so little that it could not be seen. "Murder!" the young lady of the Shui clan cried out in fear, and then her voice came to a screeching halt. Madame Shui covered her mouth, her hand constantly trembling, but she used great strength to prevent her daughter from making a single sound. She could clearly see that the beauty dressed in palace attire was Mou, and that bloody person, Zhou Tong. It turned out that the neighboring courtyard belonged to Zhou Tong. She finally understood this point, and when she thought about how Shui Xingchuan had also concealed this matter from her, she couldn't help but become even angrier, her body trembling even more violently. "It's Zhou Tong." Madame Shui's voice was somewhat indistinct and cold. The young lady of the Shui clan stiffened. As she gazed at this bloody scene on the snowy street, her hands gradually clenched. Zhou Tong was like a wounded beast on the verge of death. He let out a rather strange growl as he painfully crawled out of the snow and took a few more steps forward. He knew that this was the Shui estate, knew that the mother and daughter on the stone steps were his sister-in-law and niece, so he would not turn his head to glance in that direction. He would not plead for leniency from them, as that would be seeking his own humiliation. He also did not want them to see him like a stray dog. He wanted to leave as quickly as possible, but at this moment, a shrill gust of wind from a sword landed on his left thigh. His flesh was cut horizontally, blood slowly flowing out like porridge from a pot. He heavily kneeled in the snow, snow splashing from his knees. The young lady of the Shui clan once more cried out in alarm at this sight, but this time, besides fear, there was even more joy. Chapter 724. A wounded beast on the verge of death would let out a strange growl because it wanted to keep as much sound in its throat as possible, not wanting its weakness to be heard by anyone. But when his thigh muscles were severed and he fell into the snow in front of the Shui estate, Zhou Tong could no longer hold back and let out a scream tinged with pain. This scream was drowned out by the Shui clan's young lady's cry of alarm, but it was still so clear that everyone present could hear it. The Shui clan's young lady felt even more delighted, and the Shui clan's steward was so excited that his entire body began to tremble. Logically speaking, Madame Shui, who should have had the greatest reaction, was able to maintain her composure. She quietly gazed at Zhou Tong lying in the snow. It was very quiet in front of the Shui estate. Only Zhou Tong's heavy breathing could be heard. After an unknown period of time, Zhou Tong crawled up from the snow and continued to stagger along the west side of the street, leaving behind a trail of blood. Mou walked to the stone steps, turned to Madame Shui, and nodded her head in greeting. A few years ago, Shui Xingchuan and she had both been the most popular personages of the Tianhai dynasty, so the two naturally interacted. Madame Shui very seriously returned her greeting, saying, "Thank you." Mou said nothing. Nodding her head again, she followed Zhou Tong. Madame Shui gazed at the warm yet gloomy sky and thought of that day. She silently said her thanks to Chen Chongqing. With the end of the Tianhai dynasty, her husband had gone from a loyal subject of the great Zhou dynasty to a traitor, and Zhou Tong had clearly been a traitor, but he had become an important minister of the great Zhou dynasty. This was naturally unfair, but in this world where no one dared to pay homage to traitors, just who would seek justice for a traitor? That day in the Orthodox Academy, she had said that she hated that Zhou Tong did not die. This was a true hatred, a hatred tinged with despair, a hatred that seeped into her bones. At the time, Chen Chongqing had said nothing, had not comforted her, only calmly gazed at her. When sending her off from the Orthodox Academy, he had requested that she not leave the capital. This was a promise. He would kill Zhou Tong and let her see it. So Madame Xue did not return to her hometown, but remained in the capital. She wanted to see this scene with her own eyes. It was at this moment that she finally saw it. From the moment that Xue Xingchuan was poisoned to death to his corpse to being exposed to the public, she had rarely wept. But at this time, 2 lines of hot and somewhat scalding tears flowed from her eyes. She took one last look at the scene of Zhou Tong struggling for his life in the snow, then ordered the steward, close the door. Miss Xue was a little surprised. She held her mother's arm and said, "Mother, I want to see more. I haven't seen enough." Everyone wanted to see their most powerful and invincible enemy reduced to a wounded wild dog. Who wouldn't be able to get enough of that? Enough. It was hard to tell if Madame Xue was talking about this matter or her daughter, but she turned and entered the estate. The gate slowly closed, blocking many things and memories outside. There was snow everywhere on the road of peace, and blood was everywhere on the snow. More and more blood flowed out of Zhou Tong's body, so much so that the poison became much fainter, and the blood gradually regained some of its red color. More and more bloody wounds appeared on his body. They were densely packed, and he looked incomparably miserable. These wounds were very particular. Their depth and position were enough to make him feel excruciating pain, but they were not enough to immediately end his life. When she attacked, Mo's beautiful face was devoid of emotion, her face indifferent to the extreme. Coupled with her blood-stained palace gown, she looked like the maid of the god of death. Occasionally, sword glows would illuminate the gloomy street. Zhou Tong arduously advanced through the snow. He had long since found it impossible to stand firm, and often had to use both his hands and feet to move forward. It seemed like he might collapse at any moment, never to stand again. He could no longer suppress his pain and fear and maintain the silence of an old wolf. Every time a sword glow lit up, a wretched howl could be heard. This was the most thorough form of humiliation and torture to the body and mind, a torture that would seemingly never end. This had always been the death of 1,000 cut. If it were anyone else, no matter how strong their will was, they would have crumbled at this moment. Even if they did not kneel and beg for mercy from their enemies, they would probably do everything in their power to commit suicide. But Zhou Tong did not, because he had tortured and humiliated far too many people in his life, had inflicted far too many tortures on the innocent. He had seen the darkest and most painful scenes of the world, had experienced the true hell. His heart was like a stone that had been soaked in poisonous water for 70,000 years, every patch of moss growing on it the embodiment of evil. Even though Mo's cruel methods made his body and soul tremble, it was still impossible for him to surrender, whether to her or to fate. Before death arrived, he would never willingly accept it. On the contrary, he was still like a beggar, thirsting for the final victory. As long as he could crawl through this long street of blood, he would win. He screamed, and then he said to himself in his heart. The twilight grew thicker and thicker, turning into night. The white snow on the road of peace reflected the starlight, but it was not enough to illuminate this world. At some point, a dim yellow light suddenly descended and fell on Zhou Tong's body. Through the terrifying wounds, one could clearly see his bones. The distant light did not have any warmth, but Zhou Tong suddenly felt his body grow warm. In the small courtyard, his eyesight had already suffered severe damage. It was a blur, and he could only make out a rough outline. However, he was very sure that the light was to his right, which was to the north of the road of peace. This was the estate that Grand Preceptor Cheng had left in the capital before he retired. Recently, it had been seized by a prince with overwhelming power and had become a prince's estate. He used a quarter of an hour, enduring the pain of 1,000 cuts, to crawl a distance of some 60 zhang. Finally, he left the boundaries of the Shui estate and arrived here. He could endure it because there was hope. From the very beginning, his hope had been here. His vision was still blurry, but his eyes lit up as if some kind of flame had been ignited by that light. He still had a bit of true essence left, hidden in the deepest parts of his meridians. No matter how sharp Mo's sword was or how callous her methods were, it was useless, because it was not enough for him to escape this desperate situation. At this time, the dew-like true essence began to burn, bringing his body up from the snowy ground, swiftly rushing towards that light. He rushed to the prince's estate, but he no longer had any strength left. He fell to the bottom of the stone step. "I am Zhou Tong, Prince of Zhongshan, save me!" He used the last of his strength to yell out these words. He had never felt despair. Over the countless years, he had played with the thoughts of countless people in the palm of his hand. He was keenly aware that neither Mou nor Zhixio would allow him to die immediately, especially when they were in complete control of the situation. This was because they would not be able to vent the tyrannical emotions and desire for vengeance that existed in the depths of their hearts. This was his chance, and he had to seize it. He angrily and derisively thought, "Even if you princes want to pretend that you can't hear my screams, can you say that you can't hear my cries for help?" Right now, it was difficult for him to say a single word, but he did not directly yell for help, but for a prince to save him. He did not even forget to yell for that prince's name, all so that the prince would appear. "I am a minister of the great Zhou dynasty, Zhou Tong. I am in danger. Prince of Zhongshan, save me!" At some point, the clouds in the sky had gathered together, obscuring the starlight and causing the snow to fall once more. The gate of the Prince of Zhongshan's estate opened, as did many other gates on both sides of the road of peace. Many lanterns appeared in the darkness, so bright that they were somewhat dazzling. The long street in the darkness transformed into a silver river. In the river, Zhou Tong could no longer suppress his emotions. An intoxicated expression appeared on his face as he gave a neurotic laugh. With several dozen whooshes, the experts of the prince's estate arrived on the street. Mou walked out of the snow, several zhang away from Zhou Tong. Zhou Tong looked at her, his blood-stained face revealing a fierce expression. "How will you kill me now? It's time for someone else to kill you." His eyes expressed his meaning very clearly. Mou did not even glance at him. The night wind gently ruffled her palace dress, causing snow to fall on her temples. She gazed at the brightly lit road of peace, at the tensome princely estates, and said, "The Empress has treated all of you badly, but there is at least one benefit." These words were spoken to those princes who had yet to show themselves. The sons of Emperor Xian are all still alive. The lantern light illuminated her face, making it even more beautiful and moving. But her expression was still cold and indifferent, her face brimming with toughness, faintly similar to that of the deceased. "Not a single one is left, and all of you are still alive. It was the Empress who allowed all of you to live until tonight. Tonight, I want all of you to return this benefit. I want him dead." The light snow fell without a sound, just like the silence of the long street at this moment. After some time, someone in the lantern light waved their hand. Zhou Tong's vision was blurry, so he could not clearly make out this person's appearance. He could only see that this person was wearing a bright yellow robe. The Prince of Zhongshan's estate had not closed its gates, but those who had walked out had all retreated. What was going on here? Zhou Tong felt this to be absurd, thinking, "Is your Highness not afraid of angering the venerable Taoist?" Mou walked up behind him. Fear once more enveloped his body. Gasping for breath, he crawled forward. There were tensome princely estates on the road of peace, the Tianhai clan, and the ministers. The Prince of Zhongshan was a madman, but was everyone else a madman? He crawled and crawled, crawled and crawled, wanting to crawl to the next place where the lights were fading. But when he was still very far away, the lights there were extinguished. It was to the extent that the prince's estate had even closed its gates. Soon after, the heavy gates began to slowly close, and the lights on the street began to go out one by one. The darkness grew deeper and deeper. Zhou Tong grew colder and colder. He crawled through the cold and wet snow, through the long blood-stained street. All his silence and perseverance had begun with hope, but had ended in despair. Chapter 725. Zhou Tong struggled to crawl through the snow, his throat gurgling, ultimately transforming into a weak, sobbing yell. "Save me! Who will save me?" His previous wretched cries had more or less been faked. But from the underground Zhou prison, to the small courtyard bathed in sunlight, to the long street covered in snow, he had constantly fled, chasing after hope, only to be disappointed again and again. Now, he finally despaired, his will collapsing like a dam broken by a flood. As he sobbed in pain, some of the blood on his face was washed away by his old tears, and then frozen by the cold wind, turning it into a viscous shell. It was a very unsightly sight. His sobs were like the cries of an owl, extremely unpleasant to hear. As the most famous ruthless official, Zhou Tong had never forgiven this world. He had never shown the slightest bit of kindness towards this world. He had saved this world once, so naturally, this world was also absolutely cold to him. It would not forgive him, and no one would come to save him. The lights on the road of peace gradually faded, and the road ahead of him was dark. Several estates still had their doors open. The one closest to Zhou Tong was the Prince of Zhongshan's estate. The depths of the estate were brightly lit. The Prince of Zhongshan sat on a chair, a frozen pear in his hand. As he recalled Zhou Tong's miserable appearance in front of the estate's gate, he felt very happy, and even the pear seemed a little sweeter. A Wang Fu subordinate at the side wanted to say something but hesitated. He said, "This subordinate still feels that it is not appropriate." "What's wrong?" "I've wanted to tear that old dog to pieces for a long time." The Prince of Zhongshan fell silent for a while, then added, "And Mou's words are reasonable. Whether I'm feeling or not, the fact that I can live to this day is a favor." This official was very shocked. He had not expected that the prince would actually be moved by Mou's words. It must be known that of the princes scattered throughout the provinces and counties, the Prince of Zhongshan's situation was the most miserable. Compared to those princes of the side branches that had been poisoned to death, he truly had survived, but he had been forced to eat shit and feign madness. This was an even more terrifying experience than death. Is shit delicious? Of course not, but did you ever think that, if that woman could force me to eat shit back then, how could she not know that I was feigning madness? The Prince of Zhongshan expressionlessly replied, "She naturally knew that I was pretending to be crazy. The reason she didn't expose me was because she liked seeing me eat shit, but at the very least, she didn't have me die. Compared to death, what does eating shit count for? Those of us who were born in the Emperor's family, which one of us doesn't have the ability to eat shit?" More than a dozen princely estates had closed their doors for different reasons, keeping Zhou Tong outside. The most honest and cowardly of them all, the Prince of Luoyang, was hiding in the deepest part of the third layer of bedding. On one hand, he was worried about the safety of his acquaintance, Mou, while on the other, he was silently speaking ill of Zhou Tong. The most experienced, prudent, and authoritative prince of Xiang was not even in the prince's estate today. The gate to the Prince of Xiang's estate was open. The young Prince Chen Lu stood in the light, his expression calm, his brow furrowed in worry. Zhou Tong crawled across the snow, and Mou followed behind him. Prince Chen Lu ignored Zhou Tong and said to Mou, "It's about time." Mou ignored him and continued to use her sword as a whip, urging the bloodied Zhou Tong forward. At the end of the road of peace was an extremely large estate, decorated with exquisite and luxurious decorations. Even the newly constructed estate of the Prince of Xiang could not compare. This was the Tianhai clan, the most powerful clan on the continent in the last 200 years. The important figures of the Tianhai clan, such as clan leader Tianhai Chenwu and several elders, would naturally not remain in the capital at such a sensitive time. They had long since gone to the estate on the outskirts of the capital. The gate was wide open and brightly lit. Tianhai Xingxue stood under the light, his clothes whiter than snow. Zhou Tong crawled across the snow in front of the gate and glanced at him, his eyes venomous. But whether it was pleading for help or cursing, he no longer had the strength to speak. A tinkling laugh rose up, gradually turning into sobs. The Princess of Ping was held behind Tianhai Xingxue. After the coup in the palace, she had been brought back by the Tianhai clan. It was said that after some time, she might be married off to Prince Chen Lu. As she watched Zhou Tong struggle through the snow, she laughed somewhat crazily, her beautiful face covered in tears. "You're like a dog today," she shouted at Zhou Tong, but it also seemed like a curse. Tianhai Xingxue did not stop her, only put his arm around her shoulder, not allowing her to impulsively attack Zhou Tong. He looked at the blood-covered Mou and solemnly said, "It's about time." This was the same meaning as Prince Chen Lu's words. Mou was a target the imperial court had to capture, placed at the top of the list. Mou still said nothing. She had never thought about leaving the capital alive. Zhou Tong's mind was no longer clear. Even despair and rage had withdrawn from his mind. In his final moment, he only had one question. Why did no one come to save him? Principal Shang only needed to move a finger to keep me alive, so why did I have to die? Just like those massive beasts on the snowy plains of the north, when they sensed that they were on the verge of death, they would often subconsciously head to the place they were most familiar with and wait for death to descend. To Zhou Tong, the place he was most familiar with was naturally the small courtyard in the alley of the Northern Military Department, so he headed there. That place was actually very close to the Road of Peace. When the Shui estate was holding the ceremony, he had been able to quickly lead his subordinates there precisely because of this reason. But if he had to crawl across the snow-covered street, the road would become extremely long. Moreover, sword glows would occasionally flash behind him. Mou still occasionally swung her sword, and every time her sword descended, it would cut off a piece of flesh from Zhou Tong's body. Zhou Tong's blood was almost completely drained, his screams growing weaker and weaker until they could no longer be heard. He was like a senseless wooden man, incessantly crawling across the snow. A crowd of onlookers appeared on both sides of the street. They looked at the bloodied Zhou Tong, who was constantly being cut and humiliated. After the initial shock, it turned into some sort of extreme pleasure. Every time Mou swung her sword and cut off a piece of Zhou Tong's flesh, the crowd would cheer. Snow was still falling from the sky, but the night sky to the west was already filled with stars. The ground of the courtyard in the alley of the Northern Military Department had already been destroyed, cut into countless pieces by countless sharp swords. Zhou Prison had truly been destroyed. Whether it was the buildings on the ground, the dungeons, or the cells hidden in the deepest depths of the earth, all of them had revealed their true appearances. Those instruments of torture covered in blood and human fragments, those severed limbs and corpses, had formed a purgatory on earth. Shui had opened the doors to all the cells ahead of time. The lightly injured prisoners had scattered in all directions, leaving only those heavily injured and on the verge of death behind. Those prisoners who had undergone countless cruel tortures were the most direct proof of this hell on earth. Starlight spilled down on Zhou Prison, a holy and beautiful contrast against the filthy and repulsive blood. A deathly stillness. Xiaoda and the experts of the army had killed people like flies, and the assassins of the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets were extremely sinister, but they had never seen such a miserable sight. Even the officials of the Department for Purging Officials felt rather disgusted by those blood-soaked cells and those grotesquely shaped instruments of torture, even though they had clearly seen them many times and personally carried out countless punishments. Perhaps it was because these bloody and repulsive scenes had never been exposed to the light of day like they were now. There was no sign of Zhou Tong. Many noises could be heard from outside the courtyard, but there was also a strange sense of tranquility. Chen Chongqing was covered in blood, his own blood or someone else's. He walked out of the courtyard. All his swords had already returned to their sheaths, but no one stopped him. The streets were packed with people, a dense mass of people. It was just that there was a large empty space in the center. Zhou Tong lay on the snow on the verge of death. His body was covered in wounds that no one could clearly count. It would not be an exaggeration to say that he had been hacked to pieces. Chen Chongqing walked up to him. With great difficulty, Zhou Tong raised his head to glance at Chen Chongqing. He actually recognized who Chen Chongqing was, and a final hope appeared in his heart. In his view, Chen Chongqing assuredly hated him, or else he would not have been so determined to kill him. He was not afraid that Chen Chongqing hated him, only that Chen Chongqing did not hate him enough. He firmly believed that he had a deep understanding of the human heart. The more one hated, the more one could not bear to see an enemy die. Come, cut me a few more times, torture me, humiliate me, castrate me, feed me lard, raise me into the most unsightly of fatties, and then squeeze the fat out of me to light a lamp. Anything is fine, as long as you don't kill me on the spot. I beg you. Perhaps because he had heard Zhou Tong's thoughts, Chen Chongqing unsheathed his sword. There was no humiliation or torture, no callous vengeance, only a bright sword glow, a clean killing intent. With a swish, a thin line of blood appeared on Zhou Tong's neck, and then it rapidly spread and widened, ultimately separating his head from his body. Zhou Tong was dead, his eyes wide open in confusion. He was probably confused. How could it be so simple? Chen Chongqing did not give Zhou Tong's corpse another glance. He walked up to Mou and said, "You've come." Mou replied, "Yes, I've come." She felt rather tired and sat down on the snow. Chen Chongqing also felt rather tired, so he sat down on the snow next to her. The shadows at the corner of the street slightly rippled and Zhixiu appeared. He was also very tired, but he did not sit down on the snow, because he knew that there would still be a battle. The earth quaked, the snow loosened, and the sound of hooves thundered like a storm. Several hundred black-armored Imperial Guard soldiers had arrived. Xiaoda and the other experts of the Imperial Court were standing around. Some blue-clothed Taoists had also arrived at some point, their cultivations unfathomable. Suddenly, there was the sound of hooves and a young eunuch arrived on horseback, his hand holding a bright yellow imperial edict. The imperial edict naturally came from the palace. The young eunuch announced Zhou Tong's crimes in front of everyone, a total of 22. The 22 crimes had been calculated after the fact. At the time, no one could clearly remember the specifics. Everyone was in a state of shock, whether it was the officials of the Department for Purging Officials or the soldiers of the Imperial Guard. Chen Chongqing also did not remember the scene at the time. He only remembered that the young eunuch's voice was rather sharp and erratic, sometimes near and sometimes far. In short, it did not seem real. He also faintly remembered that the imperial edict seemed to mention death by 1,000 cuts at the very end. But the current Zhou Tong had already become a badly mangled corpse on the snow, his head and body severed in two. There was no way to express his gratitude. 1. I wish everyone a happy new year, the health of your entire family, and good luck in everything. 2. This chapter was written very pleasantly. 3. I did not ask for a monthly vote this year. Today there is still 1 hour left. I have nothing to do, so I ask everyone for a monthly vote. I ask everyone to help me vote. Of course, next year, I will continue to not ask for a vote just for this 1 hour. 4. The title of today's chapter is not bad. When I wrote it, I suddenly thought of the fierce blade in the snow. Chapter 7:26. The reading of the imperial edict concluded, but the scene was still as quiet as a deathly stillness. The gazes of the crowd rested on the snowy ground, seeing Zhou Tong's head and body separated from his body. Their emotions were shocked and complicated to the extreme. It would not be an exaggeration to describe this person as guilty. This person was naturally guilty, but no one had expected the imperial court to declare him guilty. The crowd then turned to the young man and woman sitting side by side on the snowy ground. The hands holding the reins of the great Zhou's black cavalry were somewhat stiff. They didn't know what to do next. Should they charge or put down the spears in their hands? The redcoat cavalry and officials of the department for purging officials were pale as if their parents had died. The assassins from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets and the experts of the military all turned to Xiaoda, wanting to know just what was going on. Changes in the situation were always so sudden that even the people involved would be caught unprepared. Even Chen Chongqing and Mou were momentarily at a loss. Only when the young eunuch left did they faintly understand. If they had known this would happen, there would have been no need to act like this. Many people would probably feel this way, but they would not. Only those idiots would think this way. Mou combed back her somewhat disheveled hair and gazed at the crowd that still surrounded them. She gave a derisive smile and said, "If Zhou Tong was still alive, he would still be an important minister of the court. Only when we killed him would he be skinned and his flesh torn apart, his bones used to make soup. This truly has always been Master's way of doing things." Chen Chongqing felt that tonight's snowy wind was somewhat bone-chilling. Gazing in the direction of the imperial palace, he continued after a moment of silence, "When we were little, senior brother and I believed him to be a poor Taoist priest. Because he was too poor, his view of all things in the world was rather extreme, and his conduct was rather stingy. Only now do I understand that this should be called exhaustion." The snowstorm enveloped the imperial palace. The earth dragons in the side halls were burning very hot, as warm as spring. A few imperial edicts from years past were placed on the table. "I never thought that your junior brother would actually be able to kill Zhou Tong. His performance has exceeded my expectations, and I'm very satisfied. I'm even more satisfied with the method Mou and him used to kill Zhou Tong. The more cruel and unyielding their methods, the more shocking this story will be, and the more people will remember it. This naturally includes Zhou Tong's evil deeds." Shang Xingzhou looked at the young emperor behind the table and said, "Although Zhou Tong betrayed your mother and worked for me, no one can deny that in the past many years, he has been your mother's spokesperson. Thus, his evil is your mother's evil. The more Chen Chongqing displays his evil, the worse your mother's image will be. As the leader of the conspiracy to overthrow your mother's rule, the less negative evaluation I will have. At the same time, the higher your junior brother's reputation is, the higher my reputation is. No matter how you look at it, tonight's matter is beneficial to me. I just need to issue that decree in a timely manner afterward." Yurin thought of the books in Xining Village's old temple, the fish in the stream, the beasts in the mountains, and fell silent. Shang Xingzhou continued, "This method is rather petty, but it's not miserly. It's just making the best use of everything." Yurin raised his head and made a few gestures with his hands. "Could it be that, from the very beginning, everyone in the capital was being used by you? It wasn't like this at the beginning. Of course, I wanted to protect Zhou Tong, and I truly did intend to do some things tonight." Shang Xingzhou very patiently explained, "But in this process, the situation changed, so I also had to make corresponding changes. To cultivators, change was an unchanging law under the starry sky. All things in the world were constantly changing, and the situation of the times was no different. Even if it was only a few hours, many changes could occur, just like a river during the spring thawing. If one did not deal with it properly, even the sturdiest metal bridge would be washed away." Shang Xingzhou did not explain what those changes were. Perhaps because Chen Chongqing's strength had surpassed everyone's expectations, he had endured for an entire day. Those swords had cut open the hard ground that had been frozen by the winter wind, exposing Zhou prison to the starlight. Perhaps because the Li Palace had remained quiet the entire time, the snow and clouds drifting in the sky were like a tame flock of sheep, showing no intention of crossing the fence. Of course, the most likely reason was that Wang Pe had severed his arm, broken through, and killed Tai Shu on the Luo River. Moreover, the lights of the princely estates on the snowy road of peace had been extinguished one by one. "Do you know why your master is called Shang Xingzhou?" Shang Xingzhou suddenly asked. Yu Ren knew that Shang Xingzhou was not his master's true name. At least 600 years ago, he had been called Daoist Ji. The appearance of this name, or the acquisition of it, assuredly meant something. Before His Majesty returned to the Sea of Stars, he still did not forget those words. Water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize it. Shang Xingzhou's gaze rested on a certain place in the palace, seemingly returning to several hundred years ago. Everyone on the continent knew this famous saying, and Yu Ren was naturally no exception. He also knew that the His Majesty in this saying was not his father, but his grandfather. That night, His Majesty said to me, "Walking in the world is like rowing a boat in the ocean. One must be cautious and careful, and one must not go against the current, or else the boat will capsize." Shang Xingzhou very calmly said, "Since everyone wants Zhou Tong dead, since this is the will of the people, I naturally have to comply." To the master and disciples of Xining Village's old temple, this was a very important word. This was the Tao they cultivated. Only tonight did Yu Ren understand that it originated from the saying, "Water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize it." Shang Xingzhou continued, "Of course, following the current does not mean obeying. The boat only hopes that the water can be calmer, that there won't be too many waves, that there won't be too much resistance." Yu Ren gestured with his hands. "But in the end, the boat still has to revere the existence of water. The Duke of Wei once said, 'Resentment is not great, only people to be feared.' To carry a boat and capsize it, one must be careful. How can one not fear?" Shang Xingzhou looked into his eyes and said, "But positions are relative. Since you are the boat, you cannot consider the feelings of the water too much." Yu Ren gestured. "In the end, you still have to consider it, or else Sir would not have changed your mind. In everyone's view, I have already done all I could, but I was stopped by you and them." Shang Xingzhou's gaze fell on his waist, where the jade pendant the Qiushan clan head had offered as tribute. "You young people are all gambling with your lives. You are like this, Mou is like this, Wang Po is like this, and your junior brother is even more so. I raised your junior brother for 17 years, so how could I bear to kill him? I could only watch helplessly as he killed Zhou Tong. If anyone were to ask me about tonight's matter, I would be able to answer with a clear conscience." Yu Ren could no longer tell which of these words was true and which was false, but he understood. Zhou Tong was the ugliest and dirtiest stain on the body of the new dynasty. Qin Chongqing was the deepest and most difficult thorn in his master's heart. His master did not care who died, as long as he did not have to personally do it. Today, the several soul-stirring battles and pursuits in the capital were highly likely to shake the entire human world, but they had always been under his master's control. No matter how it changed, he would always be the final victor. If Wang Pe had been killed by Tai Shu on the Luo River, this victory might have been perfect. This was not a situation that I planned, and I cannot control everything. After all, I am not a god, nor am I Emperor Taizong. Shang Xingzhou rejected Yu Ren's idea, saying, "Today was more like a lesson. If your majesty wishes to become a mighty person like Emperor Taizong, to lead the human race into an incomparably bright future, you must learn to sail with the current. No matter how much you loathe those foolish and idiotic commoners who cheer at the execution, you must still convince yourself that they are the true ocean. You must learn how to lead them, how to deceive them, how to borrow their strength to brave the waves and advance. Yuren could not completely understand this, nor was he very concerned about it. He only cared about one thing. He gestured with his hands and asked, "Master, do you really not like junior brother?" Shang Xingzhou thought this over, then smiled. "Yes, I don't like him. I really want him to die, or perhaps I should say that I wish that he had never lived." Happy New Year. Chapter 727. Everyone knew that Shang Xingzhou did not like his student, Chen Chongqing. As for the reason, Yu Ren and Chen Chongqing had roughly guessed at it, and their guesses were only getting deeper and deeper. But to the people of the world outside of Xining Village's old temple, this had always been an extremely difficult question to understand. From a personal point of view, Shang Xingzhou had raised Chen Chongqing from a young age. Even if all this had begun as a scheme, in his view, Chen Chongqing should still be more trustworthy than anyone else. Even if Shang Xingzhou wanted the human race to achieve unprecedented unification and thus defeat the demons, supporting Mu Jiushi to become pope and thus ally with the great Western continent was not necessarily better than Chen Chongqing ascending to the position of pope and the imperial court obtaining the full support of the Li Palace. No one could understand Shang Xingzhou's thoughts, and not even the pope's conjectures were tenable. After brushing past each other in the mausoleum of books in the morning light, all this had happened naturally. However, in the many stories that followed, Shang Xingzhou had never clearly expressed that he wanted Chen Chongqing to die. Even if this was a secret known to the entire world, in the end, Shang Xingzhou had never expressed it on paper, never put it into action. Only tonight, when Shang Xingzhou admitted it to Yu Ren, did he reveal his intentions to the heavens and earth for the first time. The starry sky instantly dimmed as an invisible killing intent enveloped the capital. Chen Chongqing's life and death depended on one's own efforts, depended on Shang Xingzhou's attitude, and now it was inextricably linked to the life and death of another mighty figure. The Li Palace had long ago expressed its stance. The Pope would not permit Shang Xingzhou to harm Chen Chongqing. The problem was, how many more days did the Pope have left to live? In the end, nothing happened in the Li Palace that night. The starlight, torn apart by the snow and scattered clouds, fell upon Madame Mu's clothes, so beautiful that it seemed unreal. As dawn approached, Shang Xingzhou finally left the imperial palace, arriving between the gray eaves of the 5 beautiful and divine old temples of the Li Palace. Before he formally appeared, Madame Mu had already left, bringing with her a sky of snow and starlight. Other than the Pope, the Li Palace would only ever allow one saint to enter. To the orthodoxy, this would mean war. That night, Shang Xingzhou and the Pope engaged in a very long conversation, probably the last conversation of their lives. No one knew what they discussed or whether the imperial court and the orthodoxy had reached some sort of agreement, but starting from the next day, a warm spring breeze descended upon the capital ahead of time. An atmosphere known as reconciliation gradually began to spread. Zhixiu and Mo Yu were taken out of the court of judicial review. The former was sent by the army to the north, while the latter was returned to the Orange Garden and temporarily placed under surveillance. It was still winter, and the so-called spring breeze was naturally illusory. Everyone knew that this situation could last for a long time, and it could come to an abrupt end at any time. No one knew how many more days the Pope could live, nor did they know that once the Pope returned to the Sea of Stars, Shang Xingzhou would not keep the promise he made that night. The atmosphere in the capital gradually became tense. Many people seemed to have already seen the violent storm in advance. No, in the middle of winter, it should be a blizzard. Amidst the uneasiness and anticipation, the new year approached. There was a heavy snowfall in the capital, turning the streets and buildings white. It was a beautiful sight. The Li Palace in the snow was even more beautiful. Chen Chongqing supported the Pope as they walked out of the secluded side hall and arrived at the largest plaza in the center of the group of palaces. In the past few years, he had often gone to the Li Palace, but the place he went to the most was this secluded side hall. This was his first time coming here with the Pope. The gray stone plaza was covered in snow like a carpet. The stone pillars that seemed scattered but were actually arranged in an orderly fashion were already covered in snow. Chen Chongqing's spiritual sense could clearly sense that an extremely ancient and distant qi was concealed beneath the plaza. If this was an array, it was probably no weaker than the imperial design. Gazing into the distance, several palaces were faintly discernible in the wind and snow. He knew that those were the famous Grass Moon Hall, Pure Kasha Palace, Moss Institute. There were 6 halls in the Li Palace, and each hall had a precious treasure that represented the history and supreme authority of the orthodoxy. That was why the saying of the 6 prefects was gradually developed. He knew why the Pope had brought him here. The divine and vigorous qis in the Grass Moon Hall, Pure Kasha Palace, and other places were all expressing their allegiance to him. This year's snow is too great. The Pope's gaze pierced through the snow and fell upon the distant north, his wrinkled and spotted face revealing worry for the future. Xuelao City is in internal strife and the demons are unprecedentedly weak. This snowstorm will cause many tribes to waver and incite many battles. At the beginning of spring next year, the wolf cavalry will assuredly move south. The snowstorm was very beautiful, but also very cruel. The demons would assuredly suffer enormous losses, and with this rebellion, Xuelao City would not be able to recover its strength in a short period of time. Under these circumstances, the Pope's conclusion that the demon army would invade the south next year didn't sound very logical, but Chen Chongqing understood that this was something that would inevitably happen. The demon race was a crazy and terrifying race. The weaker they were, the more bloodthirsty and cruel they were. This was because they knew that this was the only way they could survive this most difficult period of time. The Pope sighed, "Since we hate each other, it's better to leave as soon as possible." These words had no head or tail, and only Chen Chongqing could understand them. After the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, many people had speculated that he would leave the capital. In truth, he had always wanted to leave, but at the time, he knew that his master would not let him leave unless he died. Now it seemed that the conversation between the 2 saints in the Li Palace had ultimately changed something. "Very well," he said. The Pope looked at him and said, "You are the successor I have chosen. No matter how many years pass, you must return." Chen Chongqing replied, "When I am needed, I will return." The Pope said, "He wishes to speak with you." Chen Chongqing thought it over, then replied, "Very well." The Li Palace glowed with light. The snow falling from the night sky seemed to become the heavenly flowers of the divine kingdom, so beautiful that it was intoxicating. The priests and cavalry of the orthodoxy, as well as the various levels of clergy, stood on the plaza, occasionally illuminated by the light, like a vast ocean under the morning sun. The great hall of light was even more dazzling, making it impossible to look directly at it. It was indescribably dignified. In the great hall, several thousand cardinals and archbishops bowed, their faces filled with piety and reverence. The stone wall slowly opened. Under the gazes of the 12 sages and the statues of the heroic spirits of the divine kingdom, the Pope and Chen Chongqing walked out from the light. The Pope took the divine crown from Mao Chuyu's hands and placed it on Chen Chongqing's head. Chen Chongqing gripped the divine staff and walked to the very front. He began to receive blessings and to give them. His body was somewhat stiff, but his expression was extremely serious, his movements meticulous. He had not made a single mistake. Even the tiniest request in the Taoist scriptures could be called perfect. Chapter 728. Chen Chongqing stood in the light at the very front. The Pope was behind him. In the great hall, several thousand bishops knelt on the ground like a tide. In the plaza, tens of thousands of orthodoxy cavalry and priests knelt on the ground like a tide. Outside the Li Palace, tens of thousands of believers knelt on the ground like a tide. At this sight, the Pope slowly narrowed his eyes, as if he had drunk a fine wine, very satisfied and happy. His eyes narrowed until they closed, and then they never opened again. At this point, no one could see the vast sea of stars in those old eyes anymore. Chen Chongqing turned his head, the hand gripping the divine staff faintly trembling. Mao Qiuyu supported the Pope's body and shook his head at him. There was a faint disturbance in the nearby crowd, but there was no chaos. With Enlin and the other archbishops at the lead, everyone continued to kneel, but there was the occasional sound of weeping. The chanting that purified the Tao heart, the weeping of reminiscence and sorrow, drifted higher and higher in the majestic Great Hall of Light, and then was temporarily invited back to the mortal world by the toll of a bell. The sacred bell of the Li Palace, the Bureau of Ecclesiastic Education, and the Heavenly Tao Academy all rang at the same time. The sound of the bell swiftly spread to the entire capital and then to even further places, sending the news of the Pope's return to the Sea of Stars to every corner of the continent. Clack 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 clack. Countless sounds of metal grinding against each other seemed to resound at the same time. The orthodoxy cavalry in the plaza between the Li Palace and the palace unsheathed their weapons, a black tide rising from the sea of people. Whether it was the divine crossbows, spears, or swords, they were all cold and sharp. They pointed straight at the night sky, at those millions of silent and unchanging stars. This was not a demonstration of the human world to the sea of stars, but a show of support. In other words, this was a grand and majestic procession, sending the sovereign 1,000 li away. The Grass Moon Hall, the Pure Kasha Palace, the Moss Institute, the Clear Water Tile Platform, the Hall of the Heavenly Tao, and the Autumn Residence were the 6 most important palaces of the Li Palace. At this moment, 6 extremely divine and grand Qis emerged from these palaces and soared into the cold and lonely night sky. Then, they met somewhere and became 6 visible rays of light. The colors of these rays of light were not the same. They seemed like a rainbow. No one had ever seen a rainbow in the night. The people kneeling on the ground in the Li Palace and the people kneeling in various places in the capital all raised their heads, shocked by this phenomenon in the sky. They sorrowfully thought, perhaps this is the human world's final farewell to His Holiness the Pope? Chen Chongqing knew that it wasn't a rainbow, but power. The moment those 6 Qis emerged from the Grass Moon Hall and the other 6 palaces, he and all the cultivators of star condensation and above in the capital clearly sensed this power. This power came from the treasures of the orthodoxy in the 6 palaces, and also from the ground between the Li Palace. To be more precise, it came from the array beneath the ground. Taoism had existed for countless years and had been revered as the national religion for close to 1,000 years. In the past, it had also been the national religion of several famous dynasties. In terms of historical heritage and rich accumulation of resources, in certain aspects, even the current imperial court might not be able to compare to it. It was not strange for it to have this kind of formation and many unknown divine artifacts. For example, the torch stuck at the head of the bed, the white sun flame. This sacred artifact of the demons had been stored in the Lingyan Pavilion for many years and was an important part of the imperial design. On the night of the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, the Tianhai Divine Empress had thrown out the Frost God's spear and destroyed the Lingyan Pavilion. The portraits in the pavilion had all been burned to ash and the Frost God's spear had gone missing. People believed that it had probably been hidden away in the imperial palace. But who could have expected that the white sun flame had ended up in the Li Palace? The once sacred artifact of the demons, later on a treasure of the great Zhou, was now just an ordinary object for illumination. It was holy and blazing, but not dazzling. Moreover, its light, devoid of any warmth, shone on the Pope's elderly face, making him feel no discomfort. Chen Chongqing sat on the edge of the bed and finished reciting the scripture of longevity for the 9th time. He stood up and gazed at the white sun flame and the palace hall illuminated by it. The orthodoxy was the legacy left to him by the Pope, and the white sun flame was naturally a part of this legacy. The divine crown, the divine staff, the treasures of the 6 palaces, the array of the Li Palace, and the millions and millions of priests and believers still kneeling within and without the Li Palace, unwilling to leave, were also part of this legacy. There was also power. But he remembered very clearly that there was still this legacy, but he didn't know where it had gone. The Pope had once clearly expressed his intentions. After his death, that item was to be safeguarded by Chen Chongsheng. Where had the green leaf gone? 6 holy Qis formed a beautiful rainbow in the night sky. One end of the rainbow was in the Li Palace, piercing through the sea of stars and ultimately returning to the mortal world. Many places in the capital were illuminated and decorated by this rainbow. It was very difficult to tell which place had received more light and blessings. Everyone on the earth could see the vast sea of stars, but the starlight had never illuminated the world. At the bottom of the abandoned well near the Imperial City, near New North Bridge, there was no sunlight or starlight all year round. But today there was miraculously a great deal of light. This light was a part of the rainbow from the Li Palace. The pitch-black, gloomy, and cold underground space that had existed for several centuries had not warmed, but at least it was no longer so terrifying. This was especially the case when the light illuminated the frost and snow on the ground, as well as the many things above the frost and snow. These things gave this place that was cut off from the mortal world the flavor of the mortal world. Stoves of different heights could be seen everywhere, looking like termite nests. There were also all sorts of kitchen utensils, pots, bowls, ladles, and basins. The especially hot Tuzhou charcoal was piled into a small mountain, and there were 10 some iron pots of various sizes and thicknesses. A specially made table the size of a lake was piled with countless dishes that a normal person could imagine. About 300 zhang across from this place was most likely a study. There were no walls, and naturally no paintings or paintings hung there. There was only an incomparably long bookshelf with no end in sight. The shelves were piled high with books, and along the bookshelf, there were all sorts of furniture arranged in order. Study tables, chairs, imperial concubines, and even further away, there was an especially large bed there, not much smaller than the lake in the Orthodox Academy. This bed was especially magnificent, the carvings extremely luxuriant. 36 layers of bedding covered the bed, and the railing of the bed was inlaid with 72 night pearls. Just by looking at it, one could imagine how comfortable it would be to lie on it. The black-clothed dragon girl called Gigi, also known as Zhu Sha or Hong Zhuang, was currently lying on the bed, but it was obvious that she did not feel very comfortable. It was not because there was an unremarkable pea at the very bottom of the 36 bedding, nor was it because the last blue lobster Chen Chongsheng had sent over was not fresh enough. It was because she was very nervous. The rainbow from the Li Palace illuminated the underground cavern, and also illuminated the wall over 10 li away that she did not want to face. She was the noblest and most powerful black frost dragon in the world. She could see a silver leaf thousands of li away, so naturally, she could also clearly see that the wall was currently undergoing a change. On the stone wall covered in frost and snow, a clump of green leaves had sprouted. I have to go to Shanghai for a meeting tomorrow. I will try my best to finish writing the update before leaving. I have something to report to everyone. The electronic contract for Heaven's Chosen is signed in the world of creation, and Qidian is currently distributing the book at the same time. You can read it wherever you want. I am very grateful. I can only receive rewards from the world of creation. I'm not saying that if you want a reward at Qidian, then move it to the world of creation. That would be too troublesome, but I have to report this to you. And actually, from the first day of this system, my attitude has always been like this. I will definitely urge everyone to subscribe. I feel that this is the way we should interact. As for rewards, I really don't need it at all. As long as you subscribe to the original version, that will be fine. If you are interested and have the time, write a review or vote. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Chapter 729. The stone wall was engraved with the images of Qin Zhong and Yu Gong, 2 divine generals of the previous generation. The hands of the images were holding onto two chains that bound her feet. This was an array that Wang Jitsa had laid down back then. For the past several hundred years, no one, not even the little black dragon herself, had been able to pull out these two chains from the wall. Even if Chen Chongqing had used the canon of flowing west and his own blood, he could only hope that it would be possible in 2 years. Logically speaking, a stone wall with such a powerful array should have cut off all external life, making it impossible for any plant to grow, but now a clump of green leaves had grown. This clump of green leaves only had 3 leaves. They had originally been very plump and tender, but now they seemed rather thin and weak, as if they had consumed a great deal of energy. Perhaps it was because the roots of this clump of green leaves were too developed? Countless roots, so thin that they were almost invisible to the naked eye, grew out from the bottom of the clump of green leaves and began to spread along the images on the stone wall. Some of them found the tiniest crack, penetrated deep into the stone wall, and then, under the illumination of the rainbow, began to madly grow. The rainbow and the clump of green leaves from the Li Palace were currently attempting to break this array. The little black dragon did not know what was going on or why, so she was very perplexed and then nervous. Her small face was pale, and the cinnabar birthmark between her eyebrows became even more striking. What illuminated the world was not starlight, but a rainbow. When these rainbows came together, they were colorless. Silently and unnoticed, they shone on New North Bridge, and they shone on the Frost Flower Shop. The Frost Flower Shop had a seemingly unremarkable but actually heavily guarded garden called the Orange Garden. It was Mou's former residence, and also the prison where she was now placed under house arrest. Under the illumination of the colorless and formless rainbow, the array in the Orange Garden was like a thin layer of snow under the blazing sun, quietly melting. It did not alarm anyone or the frogs hibernating in the snow. Several small lanterns made from orange peels were hung over the window. They were very cute, and when the light seeped out, it was red, warmer than reality. Mou knelt on the prayer mat, facing the Li Palace. Her eyes were closed, her long eyelashes blinking. She felt incomparably warm. This was the Pope's final redemption for her. Perhaps it had something to do with her arranging for Chen Chongqing to enter the Orthodox Academy, or perhaps it had nothing to do with it, but it was all redemption. The rainbow vanished and the treasures of the orthodoxy in the Grass Moon Hall and the other halls gradually calmed down. The chill at New North Bridge grew even colder, and the black hole in the snow seemed like it was about to crack open from the cold. The orange trees in Frost Flower Shop were covered with fresh frost. It was a rare and beautiful scene. The lamp in front of the window was still warm, and there was no one on the futon. The Pope's funeral was held very quickly, as everything had been prepared. The diplomatic missions from White Emperor City and the South did not leave the capital after the celebration because they were all mentally prepared. It was precisely because they were prepared that although the people of the world were sad, they were not too shocked, and there were not too many emotions of fear and unease. From autumn to winter, the great Zhou had lost 2 saints in succession, and the storms of the 8 directions had suffered even more grievous casualties. If one also included Su Li and the Holy Maiden of the South, who had left early, in just a few short years, the number of peak-level experts of the human race had plummeted. But in the eyes of the common people, the demons had suffered even greater losses from their internal strife, so how could they have the courage to invade the South? There were people who did not think this way, such as the Pope who had already returned to the Sea of Stars. Besides them, those who knew the inside story also grew more and more nervous as time passed. The Li Palace had already issued a public announcement, so the entire world knew that Chen Chongqing was the Orthodoxy's new Pope, even though he had still not formally succeeded the throne. To the shock and confusion of the people, no one saw his figure at the Pope's funeral. This was a very difficult matter to imagine, but both the Li Palace and the imperial court maintained their silence. There seemed to be some sort of tacit understanding between the two. What was this tacit understanding? Was it the agreement that the Pope and Shang Xingzhou had reached after a long conversation on the night that Wang Pu and Qin Chongxing killed Zhou Tong? Or were both sides waiting for that moment to come? The new year was approaching, a page was torn off the yellow paper, and the winter sun rose once more. Many things would change. On that day, the great Zhou dynasty would formally change its name, and the young emperor's position would become unshakable. The Li Palace would hold a grand ceremony of succession, and the orthodoxy would welcome a new master. The young emperor and the young pope were martial brothers. Such a thing had never happened before in history. This also meant that the current emperor and pope would both be Shang Xingzhou's students. This was also something that had never happened before in history. From every angle, this was the pinnacle of life that the people of the world could imagine. It was even unimaginable before it actually happened. He had led the entire world in overthrowing the Tianhai Divine Empress's rule, predicted that he might even have participated in the Demon Lord's destruction, subdued the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets with a wave of his hand, and added to the fact that the two disciples he had personally taught would become the two people with the greatest authority in the secular world and in the divine world. Even if Shang Xingzhou was not a god, he was still a legend. Regretfully, there was no such thing as true perfection in the world. The fate above the starry sky would not permit such a thing to happen. In the end, this problem still had to be resolved. No matter how incomprehensible people were, why Qin Chongxing wanted to oppose his teacher, no matter how incomprehensible they were, why Shang Xingzhou disliked, even loathed, this disciple that was in fact very popular. In short, this problem had to be resolved. This was no longer a problem between master and disciple. It was now related to the fate of the entire human race and even the entire world. Just what would happen on the day of the new year? The great Zhou dynasty's first internal war? The snowstorm continued to fall. The Grass Moon Hall, the Pure Kasha Palace, and the Institute of Moss were all dyed white. A lonely trail of footprints could be seen on the snow. The streets outside the Li Palace were deserted, but an invisible energy constantly rippled between those famous stone pillars. Whether it was the priests, the officials of the various halls, the teachers and students of the 6 Ivies, or the 20,000 some orthodoxy cavalry, no one went out. The imperial court maintained the highest level of vigilance in the various military camps of the capital. Several divine generals had even led the world's famed black-armored heavy cavalry back south from the snowy plains of the north and stationed themselves on the front line of Black Valley. If one were to calculate the distance, this terrifying flood of armored cavalry had actually left the Northern Army Office 20 days ago, and at that time, the Pope was still alive. The mood in the capital was abnormally tense. On the last evening before the arrival of the new year, the snowstorm was still falling, so much so that it could even be called violent. This year, the capital was exceptionally cold. No one knew that a large part of the reason was that abandoned well not far from the imperial city. With great difficulty, the afterglow of the setting sun pierced through the clouds and snowflakes, landing on the palace walls and sprinkling down an extremely faint twilight. Suddenly, an unimaginably cold chi spread out from that abandoned well. Whether it was the withered leaves or the earth, everything was instantly frozen solid. Even the ice and snow seemed to be frozen once more in some inexplicable way, and even the twilight seemed to be frozen solid. An extremely crisp sound came from the bottom of the well to the surface. It was already very weak, not even as clear as the sobbing that had followed it. It was the crying of a little girl. She had been crying all this time, but the emotions she conveyed were different from time to time. Sometimes it was especially happy and excited, sometimes it was especially sad and sad. The soldiers on the imperial city, and the commoners in their residences all heard the girl's cries, but they did not know where they had come from. They could not find her no matter where they searched, and they were even more confused as to how a little girl could stay outside in such cold weather. How could she be alive, and how could she constantly cry? She cried from dusk all the way into the night without stopping. After that day, Besides the legend of the evil dragon, a new legend appeared in the area around New North Bridge. The protagonist of this new legend was a child bride who had been killed by her heartless mother-in-law. Chapter 730. As the night deepened, the chill grew even heavier. The ice and snow by the well had already been frozen like solid stone. A small hand appeared on the edge of the well. Under the illumination of the lanterns of the imperial city, it was very white and clean, even whiter than the ice and snow in the sky, and also seemed even colder. As the small hand exerted force, the ice and snow rustled and shattered. A girl climbed out of the well. This scene was truly very much like a horror story. The girl stood in the snow, her breath turning into a mist of ice crystals as it met the air. It was not because her chi was hot, but because it was too cold. She wore a black dress, somewhat tattered and very old-fashioned. In this world of white it was extremely striking. After several hundred years, Gigi had finally left that sinister and, to her, particularly cramped underground world, arriving in the real human world. The current human world had long ago forgotten that particularly brutal black frost dragon from the legends. She was also filled with a sense of unfamiliarity towards the current human world. Her soul had once been forcefully extracted from her dragon body by the Tianhai Divine Empress and entered the Black Jade Rui to accompany Chen Chongqing on a trip to the Garden of Zhou. In that period of time, she had seen the streets of the capital, the green trees by the lake, the prosperity of Wenshui, and that valley in the twilight, but everything before her eyes was still unfamiliar to her. At this moment, she was no longer a strand of soul, but real and complete. Her bare feet could clearly feel the soft touch and warmth of the snow. The tips of her hair could clearly feel the gentle and comfortable feeling brought by the winter wind. She could use her eyes, not her mind, to see the true wind and snow. She could even see the true starry sky behind the clouds of snow. Ah, the many stars that had not been seen for several hundred years. So you are still in the same position, scattering down the same beautiful silver radiance. Will my home in the southern islands still be the same? The sense of strangeness and reality constantly tangled and clashed in her mind, finally transforming into the truest fear. She had no idea that in the near future she would become a new legend in the human world. Although as a noble and powerful dragon, her existence was itself a legend to the human race, she was only afraid of this strange world. This world was a human world filled with humans, and humans were what she feared the most. Whether noble or lowly, strong or weak, when life was at its weakest, most confused, and most afraid, it would always habitually want to find the most familiar support. That support could be a tree, a rock, a window, or even a person. Before Zhou Tong died, his consciousness was already in a daze. All he knew was to crawl towards the alley of the Northern Military Department. In her mind there was only one person's name, and that was Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing was the person she was most familiar with in this world, and also the person she trusted the most. Due to some secret reasons, she firmly believed that he was responsible for her. Therefore, after she came back to her senses, she walked towards the Tradition Academy without hesitation. Her bare feet left a clear mark on the snow. The Tradition Academy and the neighboring herb garden were all heavily guarded. The Orthodoxy cavalry and the soldiers of the imperial court blocked off the entire street, silently confronting each other according to their respective camp. The atmosphere was abnormally tense, and no one knew what would happen next. The situation in the capital was constantly changing. With the Pope's return to the Sea of Stars, no one knew which way the hearts of the people would lean, but the people's judgment was slowly leaning towards the imperial court. The teachers and students of the Orthodox Academy were constantly leaving, and the number of people left was less than a third of the original number. The 18 girls of South Stream Temple and Su Moyu naturally remained, but they were keenly aware that they were no longer able to influence what would happen next. The two people that could truly decide the outcome were currently under the great banyan tree by the lake. Tonight, the capital was sleepless, because many people knew that this master and disciple were currently in the midst of their final negotiations. The snowstorm of the last few days had been very heavy. Just like the rest of the capital, the Orthodox Academy was covered in a thick layer of snow. The withered grass by the lake was completely covered up, and only the tips of the withered grass could be seen in the slightly bulging areas, giving off a particularly stubborn feeling. The leaves of the great banyan tree had fallen long ago, but its bare branches were still sturdy enough to bear the weight of quite a few people standing on them. Chen Chongqing was not on the tree, but standing under the tree in the snow. This was because his teacher was also standing in the snow. This was the first time this master and disciple had met since that morning in the mausoleum of Book. On that day, they had brushed past each other on the divine avenue like strangers, their gazes not shifting. Today, however, they truly looked at each other. One could clearly see that the current Chen Chongqing had changed from when he was in Xining village. Chen Chongqing was already the pope, but he did not wear the divine robe, the divine crown, or the divine staff. Instead, he wore the uniform of the Orthodox Academy. His black hair had been meticulously combed and then tied into the simplest Taoist bun. What passed through his black hair to hold the bun in place was not some precious ebony fork, but an ordinary wooden chopstick. Shang Xingzhou's black hair, devoid of the color of frost, was similarly meticulously combed. His face was brimming with nobility and steadiness, indescribably free and at ease. However, his clothes were also very simple, just a blue Taoist robe. It was like he was not truly the number one person in the world, but just an ordinary Taoist priest. If someone were to see this scene, they would probably feel that this master and disciple, from a certain perspective, were very similar. This similarity did not just lie in their outer appearances, but also in the extremely deep indifference between their brows and the sense of alienation concealed beneath their calm exterior. Chen Chongqing prepared to speak, but he didn't know what to say. It had already been several years since he and that person standing across from him had spoken. To cultivators, several years was a very short period of time, but he had always felt it to be a very long time, so long that his memories of that old temple in Xining village had become rather blurry. At the very least, there were some memories that were already difficult to recall. He could still clearly remember the mottled marks on the walls after the Taoist scriptures in the old temple had been moved away. He could still clearly remember that on the night before he left, his senior had cooked 4 plates of vegetables of different styles and taste. One of the plates had been filled with a lot of garlic, but he had forgotten the contents of his final words to his master. At this moment, Shang Xingzhou spoke. "I picked you up from the stream. Although I knew beforehand that you would be in that stream, without me, you would have drowned in the stream or been eaten by that old dragon. In short, I saved your life, and it was I who raised you into a man, so your life is mine. Tonight was the last night. Tomorrow would be a new day just like the countless days that had passed, but it would be the first day of the new continent. This conversation in the snow would determine whether the people of the capital, and even the entire continent, would be able to peacefully and joyfully welcome the rising sun of the new year like they had in the past. No one had expected that this conversation would begin so suddenly and proceed so unyieldingly, so much so that the opening words sounded like the closing words. Chapter 731. Your life is mine. As he said this, Shang Xingzhou's expression was very calm. It was like he was speaking of the world's simplest and most unquestionable truth. Just like how the sun rose in the east and set in the west, the starry sky would never change, and eggs were best fried in vegetable oil. Upon hearing this, Chen Chongqing very naturally recalled the most famous scene from the internal strife of Mount Li that year. Ruler and subject, father and son, master and disciple, these were the 3 most difficult laws to break through in the world. At the time, the Qiushan clan head had said the words father and son, and even someone as extraordinary as Qiushan Jun had been forced to stab through his own chest in order to break through these two words. What should Chen Chongqing do? In truth, everyone knew that once the conflict between master and disciple completely exploded, Shang Xingzhou would assuredly use the bond of master and disciple to smash it down. Su Moyu, the teachers and students of the Orthodox Academy, and the priests of the Li Palace were all deeply concerned, but none of them could think of a good way to deal with it for Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing had naturally mentally prepared himself for this. He had imagined this scene many times, so he was not surprised. He did not speak, mostly because he was remembering. Hearing his master's voice, thinking of Mount Li, looking at the winter trees by the lake, thinking of Tang 36's words. That was a matter from a very long time ago. At the time, he and Tang 36 had stood on the great banyan tree, gazing at the capital under the setting sun, the nearby imperial palace, and the distant Li Palace. Tang 36 had said many things related to vigilance, but they could also be understood as bad things about his master. Soon after, Chen Chongqing recalled that night when the Pope returned to the Sea of Stars. He had walked alone on the snowy ground of the Li Palace for a very long time. Before that, he had already told the Pope how he would understand and treat this relationship between master and disciple. He was not Qiushan Jun, and Shang Xingzhou was not the Qiushan clan head. There was no meaning in killing himself. He did not know that his senior brother Yu Ren had tried a similar method in the imperial palace, and even if he knew, he would not have tried it. Because this method had to be established on a certain foundation. The Qiushan clan head loved Qiushan Jun, and Shang Xingzhou loved Yu Ren. Chen Chongqing very calmly confirmed a cruel fact. His master had never liked him. The moment he completely understood this matter, he obtained true freedom and peace. Then, just like he had said to the Pope, just like Tang 36 had taught him, speak. Thank you, Chen Chongqing looked at Shang Xingzhou and said. Regardless of those disgusting and ugly plots and the shameless harm to the baby, you saved me in the stream and raised me. So, thank you. Then, there was no then. He looked calmly at the opposite side of the snowy ground. His eyes were bright, and he did not say another word. After a long period of silence, Shang Xingzhou narrowed his eyes and said slowly, That's it? Chen Chongqing thought for a while and asked, You want to get back your living expenses from these years? How much is the total? When he spoke, his expression was very serious. It didn't seem like he was joking at all, because this matter was not something that could be joked about. Even if I admit that you saved my life, I have already thanked you. What else do you want? Living expenses? Tell me, I'll give it all back to you. I'm already rich, and I have a very rich friend. Back then, on the big banyan tree, when Tang 36 said these words, his eyebrows were raised as if they were about to burn in the twilight. He was very proud. Chen Chongqing recalled the scene at that time and couldn't help but smile. Shang Xingzhou also began to laugh. His laughter was very clear and bright, completely at odds with his age and experience. It was completely different from the silent and unremarkable middle-aged Taoist in Chen Chongqing's memories. The snow on the big banyan tree rustled down. The laughter suddenly stopped. In the entire world, only you and I, master and disciple, know why I cannot let you stay in the capital. Shang Xingzhou coldly said to Chen Chongqing, Because you are His Majesty's only weakness or loophole. Many people did not understand why Shang Xingzhou's attitude towards Chen Chongqing was so unyielding. This was because they did not know of the relationship between Yuren and Chen Chongqing. A few days ago, when the snow was swirling, the young emperor had stood in the snow, blocking Shang Xingzhou's path. The jade pendant the Qiushan clan head had offered as tribute gently swayed. His resolve and will had temporarily preserved Chen Chongqing's life, but it had also deepened Shang Xingzhou's apprehension. In the future, if someone were to use Chen Chongqing to threaten Yuren, what would happen? Of course, Chen Chongsheng was already the Pope of the Orthodoxy. Logically speaking, no one could use him. But if Chen Chongsheng himself had other ideas, given the authority of the Pope and Yuan's affection for him, what would the result be? Chen Chongsheng understood, but he did not accept it. He solemnly said to Shang Xingzhou, "Master, you should be well aware that I am not this sort of person." Shang Xingzhou's expression did not change. People change. He had lived in this world for 1,000 years. He had seen far too many changes in scenery, the transformation of the sea into mulberry fields, and had seen far too many changes in people's hearts. He was keenly aware that as one's status and authority changed, even if it was often just because of a change in seat, once loyal and devoted subordinates would turn traitor, once comrades who had gone through life and death with each other would turn against each other. In the history of the great Zhou dynasty, incidents like brothers falling out with each other were common occurrences. Chen Chongsheng had never seen those storms of the past. He was still a young man like the new wind of spring. Even though he had already seen many things of decay and darkness. He solemnly said to Shang Xingzhou, "I will not become that sort of person." Shang Xingzhou replied, "I don't believe you." Chen Chongsheng asked, "Then does that mean that Master will not covet the throne?" Shang Xingzhou replied, "I won't, because that would go against the original intent of my Tao heart." Chen Chongsheng asked, "Master, you believe that you can follow your heart, that you will not covet the glory and power of the world, so why don't you believe me?" Shang Xingzhou replied, "Because I am keenly aware of where my heart lies, and you are still too young. You simply do not know where your heart lies, so how can you maintain it?" Chen Chongsheng now naturally knew that his master's lifelong pursuit was to complete Emperor Taizong's dying wish, to exterminate the demons, to seek a truly bright future for the human race, to establish a foundation for the great Zhou that would never change. For this, he would not hesitate to pay any price. Those portraits in the Lingyan Pavilion, those legendary ministers depicted in those portraits, just how many of them had died at Daoist Ji's hand? In order to overthrow the Tianhai Divine Empress's rule, just how many people had died in this world, and just how many more would die? Shang Xingzhou firmly believed that what he had done was correct, firmly believed that he was correct. He felt no guilt, much less any pressure. His Tao heart had always been clear, light as a feather, able to turn as he wished. Ascending the blue sky to swim the seven seas, also like a boulder. Even if a flood soared to the heavens, what could it do? Chen Chongsheng also cultivated the Tao of following one's heart, so he naturally understood. Because they understood, they would not be compassionate. They would only develop a sharp spirit. He could clearly see the only flaw in Shang Xingzhou's Tao. Xining Village's old temple had taught him much, and Shang Xingzhou had also taught him much. You don't like me because I am Senior's only flaw, but there is an even more important reason. Chen Chongsheng looked into his master's eyes and said, "You are afraid to see me." Chapter 732. On that day when Eunuch Lin had received the decree to enter the Orthodox Academy, Chen Chongsheng had said something similar. Shang Xingzhou had been in the Li Palace at the time, conversing with the Pope. His reaction to this was very similar. Truly childish. Chen Chongsheng's face still had a hint of childishness, but anyone could see the firmness within. He knew that his view was correct. The Tianhai Divine Empress was dead, the Pope had returned to the Sea of Stars, the Demon Lord had fallen into the abyss, and Wang Jitsa had secluded himself from the world. There were very few people in the world that could contend against Shang Xingzhou. His Tao heart was brightly lit, his Tao unhindered, and his cultivation unfathomable. He ruled over the great Zhou dynasty and possessed the friendship of White Emperor City. He seemed invulnerable, almost perfect, but he still had a flaw, a flaw. This flaw was none other than his youngest disciple, Chen Chongsheng, whom he had always disliked. Beside Xining Village's old temple was a small stream. Flowers drifted along the stream. The temple hid 3,000 Taoist scriptures, but master and disciple only cultivated one, following one's heart. Following one's heart was an extremely powerful divine ability of the Taoist faith. Only by standing under the starry sky, with a clear conscience and no regrets, could one be fearless, their Tao heart brightly lit, their Tao unhindered. In his 10-some years in Xining Village's old temple, Shang Xingzhou had never taught Yu Ren or Chen Chongxing any Taoist techniques, only had them recite the Taoist scriptures. But once they began to interact with specific cultivation methods, they would advance at an astonishing speed. Chen Chongxing's breakthrough into star condensation in 3 years and Yu Ren's ability to freely walk among the heavenly tome monoliths were both because of this. Correspondingly, this Taoist technique had an extremely high demand on the mind. It was like a snow lotus at the summit of a mountain that could not be contaminated by the slightest dirt. How could one not be confused by external objects? How could one possess an unshakable will and self-confidence? One word to remember: the heart. You only needed to be able to convince yourself. If you could convince yourself that what you were doing was right, that it was in accordance with your heart, then it would naturally follow your heart. This sounded very simple, but it was actually not. If one looked into the depths of the soul, if one were in a hidden room cut off from the world, how many people could truly say no regrets? Who can firmly believe that everything he does is right? Several hundred years ago, Shang Xingzhou was still one of the legitimate successors of the orthodoxy. He originally could have followed the predetermined path until he became the Pope, but he chose a different path. He used the name of Taoist Ji to live in this world, and when Taoist Wu painted one portrait after another in the Lingyan Pavilion, he was responsible for returning the people in those portraits to the Sea of Stars. The people in those portraits were all heroes of the human race, all meritorious subjects of the Great Zhou, but they had died just like that in a conspiracy. Some of them, like Qin Zhong and Divine General Yu Gong, were willing to die, but what about the other dukes? The heroic spirits in the Lingyan Pavilion had been watching Shang Xingzhou this entire time. Perhaps the resentful souls that had died even earlier in the 100-herb garden were also watching Shang Xingzhou. The innocent people who died in the chaos today would surely be looking at him. But these things still could not affect Shang Xingzhou's Tao heart, because he had many reasons to convince himself. He looked down on those so-called ambitious and ruthless people, and loathed schemers like Black Robe who did not dare to see the light of day the most. He viewed himself as Emperor Taizong's successor, and with the world in his heart, he could naturally disregard the trifles. For the continued existence of the great Zhou dynasty for 10,000 years, for the bright future of the human race, this was an inevitable price. But there was one thing that Shang Xingzhou still had not found a suitable way to convince himself: Chen Chongxing. Yes, the wooden basin floating in the stream, the infant in the basin, the drooping whiskers of the golden dragon, all of it was a conspiracy. But the Chen Chongxing he first saw was not the Duke of Wei, not Wang Jitze, not Tianhai, not a general of great authority, not a tycoon whose wealth was unparalleled in the world, not a noble consort with long sleeves and dancing, not a repulsive eunuch, not an impassioned scholar whose eloquence would harm the country, not an experienced and prudent minister who cherished his reputation. It was just an infant that could not even open its eyes, an infant that was ignorant and senseless, an infant that had no good, no evil, and no thoughts. He could not find any reason to convince himself that this was the right thing to do. In these 14 years, every time he saw Chen Chongxing, a question would arise in his mind, a shadow cast over his Tao heart. Life in Xining Village's old temple was very simple, and not seeing each other was countless times more difficult than meeting. Chen Chongxing had gone from an infant to a youth like the spring breeze. The shadow over Shang Xingzhou's Tao heart was already as thick as the night. I know that teacher does not feel any guilt towards me. This matter has nothing to do with good or evil. It is just that you are unable to convince yourself, and convincing yourself will always be the most important thing. Chen Chongqing looked at Shang Xingzhou and said, "So, my existence is a very frightening thing to you." Before the Buddhist sect was destroyed, there was a saying about the heart barrier. He was currently Shang Xingzhou's heart barrier. Shang Xingzhou wanted to do everything he could to get rid of this heart barrier. Only by doing so could he truly maintain the brightness of his Tao heart. He wished for Chen Chongqing to die, but he could not personally do it, as that would have no effect. It would only make the heart barrier grow deeper and deeper, and there would be no chance to get rid of it. Several days ago, even if Yuan had not used such a decisive method to keep him in the Snow Palace, he would not have gone to the alley of the Northern Military Department, but to the Li Palace. Back on the divine path of the Mausoleum of Books, when he walked down the divine path, he did not even glance at Chen Chongqing, nor did he stop Chen Chongqing from taking away the Tianhai Divine Empress's remains. He had already thought through his future plans. He wanted to use these matters as an excuse to very naturally have Chen Chongqing die at the hands of others. There were quite a few times when he was already very close to success. For instance, Eunuch Lin wanted to sweep away the threats and obstacles to the young emperor's rule. He wanted to use the matter of the Tianhai Divine Empress's remains to cause trouble and privately attempt to kill Chen Chongqing, but he did not succeed. Or perhaps he wanted to use Xue Xingchuan's encounter to use Zhou Tong as a bait to have Chen Chongqing strike first, and then kill him. Alas, none of them succeeded, Chen Chongqing said. I did not expect that you had already seen through all this, but it doesn't matter. Shang Xingzhou's expression was somewhat regretful. If not for Wang Po, you would have already died to Tai Shu that day. When Eunuch Lin suddenly attacked in the Orthodox Academy, Chen Chongqing had already understood everything, but now that he saw his master's regret, he still felt rather sad. Shang Xingzhou looked at him and continued, I swore to your martial uncle that I would not act against you, and this is the truth. Whether it's Lin or Zhou, neither of them were deliberately arranged by me. Everything happened naturally. If you had insisted on staying in the capital, these sorts of things would have happened more and more, and they would not have been affected by my intentions. It was difficult to determine whether these words were true or false, but there was no need to determine whether they were true or false. A person's intentions would always fluctuate between what was true and what was false. Even if one could see through the color and fragrance of flowers, one would still find it impossible to see through these things. On the wall across from the lake, 10 some blue-clothed Taoists appeared. These blue-clothed Taoists possessed unfathomable cultivations, and as their sleeves fluttered in the wind, they faintly exuded killing intent. Successful completion of the Genesis update. Right now, I'm just worried about whether or not it will synchronize to the starting point. If this is the case, there will be duplicate chapters. Tomorrow, during the day, I will ask the technical staff of the website to help me deal with this. If there really is a duplicate subscription, I will think of a way to make it up to everyone. Chapter 733. Is it really going to be like this? Chen Chongqing's gaze fell across the lake. The existence of these blue-clothed Taoists was no longer a secret. Many people knew that they came from the eastern capital, Luoyang, from a small and nameless Taoist monastery. I said before, I've made no arrangements, Shang Xingzhou said. The height of the sun determined the angle at which many plants grew. An important figure like Shang Xingzhou did not need to do anything or make any arrangements for many people to naturally be willing to kill Chen Chongqing for him, because he had already expressed his stance through many matters. Chen Chongqing drew back his gaze and looked at Shang Xingzhou. Even if this is a war? In accordance with the Pope's final decree, he had come to the Orthodox Academy to carry out this important negotiation with Shang Xingzhou, so he had naturally made arrangements. The Li Palace was already on standby, the Orthodoxy cavalry ready to charge at any time. When the blue-clothed Taoists arrived by the lake, Mao Chuyu and the others were probably already there. Most importantly, he was now the Pope. If Shang Xingzhou still insisted on killing him, he would assuredly incite a war that would destroy the entire capital. Many people in the Li Palace will support me, Shang Xingzhou calmly said. As the sole saint of the great Zhou dynasty, the teacher of the emperor and the pope, Shang Xingzhou's prestige had already reached an absurd level, and he was a legitimate successor of the orthodoxy. From every angle, he had the right to enter the Li Palace. Let alone the ordinary priests of the Li Palace, even the cardinals, and even some of the 5 prefects, would be willing to accept his descent. It was only because the Pope's final decree and subsequent measures were extremely unyielding and the great announcement had been announced to the world that the orthodoxy could maintain its unity and unity. If Shang Xingzhou really took the risk, even if he could not personally act, he still had enough strength to forcefully kill Chen Chongqing in the Orthodox Academy. As long as he moved fast enough and made a small enough disturbance, just what would happen next? The snowstorm enveloped the capital, also enveloped the Orthodox Academy. Together with the snowstorm was a dense mass of soldiers whose numbers were difficult to discern. A girl walked out from the other end of the snowstorm. The little girl was dressed in black. Her head was slightly lowered, and her slightly wide collar turned into a black curtained hat that covered her face. Miraculously, she walked along the street all the way to the entrance of 100 Blossom Lane, but none of the cavalrymen noticed her. Only when she got close did the experts of the imperial court and the priests of the Li Palace at the mouth of the alley see the footprints in the snow and discover her existence. "Halt!" someone shouted. It was unknown whether it was a general of the court or a cardinal. It was very likely that something big would happen tonight. The capital sank into an incomparably tense atmosphere. At this moment, a young girl suddenly walked out of the wind and snow. Anyone would find it strange. Hearing this voice, the black-clothed girl's body trembled. She lowered her head and continued to walk deeper into the alley. Her footsteps became even more hurried, as if she was afraid. Of course, such a reaction could also be interpreted as arrogance. Courting death. A sinister voice rang out from the shadows in the alley. The buildings in 100 Flowers Lane had been completely flattened by the cavalry of the imperial court in the previous few days. Only that tea-house, which had some commemorative value, was left standing. Just as the black-clothed girl walked past that ruined building, an even more sinister and venomous sword glow pierced out of the shadows along with that sinister voice. This sword glow was abnormally bright. Mixed in with the wind and snow, it was unremarkable, and the sword energy was terrifying to the extreme. Even more frightening was that as this sword glow brightened, the shadows at the mouth of the alley began to faintly emit stardust. The first to strike was a star condensation assassin, probably from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. Experts that had just been subdued by the imperial court always wanted to prove their worth as quickly as possible. A few days ago, they had encircled Chen Chongqing in the alley of the Northern Military Department, but it had ultimately turned into a chaotic and inconclusive battle. Tonight, they did not want to miss another chance. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Whether it was the assassins in the alley, the experts of the military, the guardians of the princely estates, or the Li Palace priests and experts of the various academies at the end of the alley. When the sinister sword glow arrived, the girl still had her head lowered, her face hidden in her curtained hat. She did not react at all. Yet just like that, the sword glow shattered, transforming into countless fragments that dissipated into the night sky, truly mixing in with the wind and snow. The shattering here was truly shattering. The assassin's sword had directly shattered, causing those sword glows to shatter with it. There were not many people in the world that could deal with a star condensation assassin, and to be able to shatter the sword of a star condensation assassin, many people had never seen such a person. This was not the true conclusion, because after the sword glow shattered, another object shattered. The assassin had shattered. There was only a light hum. The snow in 100 Flowers Lane suddenly turned pink, as if someone had poured several large buckets of paint into it. Soon after, several dozen chunks of flesh fell to the ground like a torrential rain. Only upon careful inspection could one clearly see that they were human limbs and organs. Blood sprayed and severed limbs fell. All of this happened in an extremely brief instant. Only then did the crowd clearly see what was happening. The black-clothed girl still had her head lowered, her face hidden in the shadow of the curtained hat, but she had extended a hand forward. This hand was very small, very white like a snow lotus, but at this moment it was dripping with blood. It was exceptionally clear and ghastly to the eye. The place where her small hand had appeared was a snowstorm. It had previously been the position of the star condensation assassin. The dark alley was deathly still. After a moment, several howls of panic and anger rose up. An assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets and 2 experts from the army transformed into 3 streams of snow and wind to attack. There were 3 soft popping sounds like 3 ripe grapes, or like 3 cracks on the surface of ice. The 3 streams of snow and wind suddenly shattered. The 3 experts of the imperial court once more became 3 showers of blood and flesh. No one could clearly see what the black-clothed girl had done, because in reality, she had not done anything at all. She had only extended her hand into the snow and wind. The snow and wind would obey her will and obliterate all existences within it. Then, she finally raised her head. The black curtained hat fell, her black hair falling down like a waterfall, revealing the face of a young girl. Her face was incomparably white, as if it had never seen the sun in its entire life. Her face was elegant and beautiful, but it possessed a biting cold chi. What was most striking was her eyes. They were vertical pupils. They seemed abnormally strange. At this moment, the emotions in her eyes were extremely complex. There was some reminiscence, some unease, some fear, and also some madness. This gaze, coupled with the blood on her snow-white face, made her seem incomparably terrifying. Suddenly, she stuck out her tongue and licked a strand of blood from the corner of her lip. At this sight, the experts hidden in the darkness and snow felt a fear that came from the deepest depths of their souls. Yesterday's upload truly did make a mistake, causing a few friends to subscribe to the previous chapter. I hereby solemnly apologize. This has nothing to do with the website. My hands were itching in a few days. I will think of a way to make it up to you. In addition, today, I have an important matter that requires everyone's help. Today, the little black dragon has finally come out of the well and appeared on the screen. In the second half of this chapter, she will play a very important role, but even now I have been unable to decide just which name to call her. Zhizhi Zhusha Hongzhuang, or Her Highness the Princess. In a little while, I will post a poll on the official WeChat account, Mounty1118. I will trouble everyone to choose. I love you all. Okay, I have posted this chapter many times. Chapter 734. These experts had either come from the military, the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets, or the Department for Purging Officials. They had experienced countless life and death battles and seen countless bitter scenes. Logically speaking, no matter how terrifying a scene was, it should not have been enough to make their hearts tremble, but the black-clothed girl had only licked the blood from the corner of her lips to make them feel incomparable fear. Some of the weak-willed people even began to tremble. This was because this fear had already surpassed the limits of experience and reason. It came from the depths of their souls, a mark that seemed to have been branded into the starry sky countless years before they were born. The black-clothed girl stood in the snow, her feet bare, a chain hanging from her ankles. She looked just like a prisoner, and it was very easy to feel pity for her. But at this moment, no one in the alley was paying attention to these details. They had already been frozen into blocks of ice by the power she had displayed and the look in her eyes. In those glass-like eyes, whether it was madness or unease, reminiscence or fear, all became apathetic in the face of the rain of blood and flesh. It was even an apathy to death. This was too frightening. Just who was she? Many people had already noticed that the black-clothed girl had a pair of bewitching vertical pupils. Could she be a great demon hidden from the world? Then what did she have to do with White Emperor City? Some people subconsciously turned to a certain snowstorm in the middle of Hundred Flowers Lane. The supreme expert of the demi-human's middle generation, Xiaoda, was currently there. When they saw Xiaoda, they were shocked once more. Xiaoda was currently in a very strange state. It was like he was suffering from a serious illness. His face was pale, and even in the cold of winter, he was constantly sweating. Countless wisps of hot steam rose from his hair and robe into the night sky, but they still could not conceal the fear and alarm in his eyes. As a great general of the demi-human race and an expert of the proclamation of liberation, Xiaoda was naturally confident. Even when facing Wang Po, who he had never been able to defeat and who made others despair, he would not be so afraid. Only when he encountered the middle-aged scholar demon lord by the stream in Mount Han did he have a similar reaction. The crowd was stunned by this sight, once more calling out that question in their minds. Just who was she? Everyone looked in fear and unease at the black-clothed girl at the mouth of the alley. At this moment, another accident occurred. The black-clothed girl suddenly bent down and began to vomit. She constantly vomited, as if only by vomiting out everything in her body would she feel better. After some time, she seemed to feel better and straightened her body. But when she saw the mess on the snow-covered ground, her snow-white face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She began to stomp her feet and complain incessantly. Her black hair danced wildly, and she looked like a little girl who had been agitated or wronged. She was very angry. The snow-white bare feet kept stepping on the snowy ground, and the chains kept rattling. Boom, 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 boom. There seemed to be thunder exploding at the entrance of the alley. The snowy ground trembled, and the heaven and earth became restless. The cold air was squeezed with all its might, and then it escaped into the distance. An unimaginably powerful aura appeared, tearing everything in its path as it followed her movements. Regardless of whether it was the softest snow or the hardest stone, regardless of whether it was the formation that had just been set up the night before or the old wall that had been built for 300 years in the south of Hundred Flowers Lane, under this terrifying aura, they all shattered into the tiniest pieces. The experts of the imperial court hidden in the darkness and snow did not dare to linger. They were all forced out, flying into the distance like arrows. For a moment, the outside of the Orthodox Academy was filled with sounds of air being torn apart and cries of fear. After some time, the black-clothed girl stopped stamping her feet. She lowered her head and stood where she was, her slightly swollen chest rising and falling. The snow at the entrance of the alley had completely vanished, and the filth that she had vomited on the snow had also disappeared. Only the ground remained. Some deep cracks had appeared on the ground, steam rising from them. Through this venting, she had somewhat calmed down, no longer as angry as before. However, as she glanced at the blood on her hands and body, anger once more appeared in her bewitching vertical pupils. This time, without waiting for her to do anything, the experts of the imperial court once more flew through the air, wanting nothing more than to fly out of the capital. Even the experts of the orthodoxy in the distance subconsciously retreated several dozen zhang. Fortunately, she did not once more fall into madness. She maintained her calm. She glanced at the filthy blood on her body. The filthy blood was frozen into frost by the extreme cold, and then rustled to the ground. This scene seemed simple, but in the eyes of those star condensation cultivators in the darkness, it was like a miracle. Just how much and how pure star radiance true essence was needed to lower the temperature to this level in such a short time. Even if experts of the divine domain like the storms of the 8 directions could do this, who would waste so much star radiance true essence just to make themselves a little cleaner? The crowd was once more stunned at this sight, once more calling out that question in their minds. Just who was she? The black-clothed girl did not know what they were thinking, nor did she care. She did not care in the slightest. She walked into the alley, the chains around her ankles dragging on the ground, clanging and clanging, then transforming into a muffled boom. That tea-house that had accompanied the Orthodox Academy in its rise and fall, that had watched many of the all-school martial exhibitions, had collapsed. The collapsed tea-house had not stirred up a single speck of dust, as countless snowstorms howled down from the sky. In the shortest amount of time, a thick layer had formed, completely covering the rubble and dust. She faced the snowstorm avoiding it. As the purest, noblest, and probably the only black frost dragon left in the world, the snowstorm had always been her subjects. After she crawled out of that abandoned well, she did not know where to go, so she had come to the Orthodox Academy. Of course, this was also because before the green leaf had pulled the chains out of the stone wall, she had made a promise to herself. Braving the snowstorm from New North Bridge, she had never felt cold. On the contrary, she felt her cheeks burn a little, because freedom truly felt good. Perhaps it was because she was about to see him as a free person. But when she was about to reach 100 Flowers Lane, she felt uneasy and fearful, because she sensed that many people were hiding in the darkness. These people could be considered experts of the human race. Although they were not enough to threaten her, they were enough to pose some trouble. But her uneasiness and fear had nothing to do with this. She was just afraid of crowds. Many, many years ago, when she had come from the warm seas of the south to this strange continent in search of her father, she had been surrounded by many people. She did not like crowds of people that crowded around her like ants. It made her feel somewhat disgusted, somewhat uneasy. She felt that the explanation given by Chen Chongqing was very correct. This was called trypophobia. What she disliked even more was that whether she was flying in the sky or walking on the ground, there would always be so many people pointing at her, shouting something, crying something. She did not understand. She had done nothing, so why would these humans cry? Because they were weak and afraid? Then should she feel sorry for being strong? She thought so. The voting on the official WeChat account is far more intense than I imagined. I originally thought that Gigi would be far ahead, but I didn't think that the other two topics would also have so many supporters. It's nearing 10,000 votes, but the difference is still around 100 votes. It's also because of this that today's chapter can only continuously use she. Even the chapter's name is she, haha. Let's end it at midnight today. The name of the little black dragon will be decided by everyone. Chapter 735. On the 7th night after landing, she was ambushed by a treacherous silver dragon from behind the clouds and sustained significant injuries. In the following half a month, she was unable to transform into a dragon and could only walk on the ground. Since she had to interact with the humans, she could only endure. If those humans were only crying, cursing, pointing, she might have been able to endure, but when that scholar surnamed Zhou from the countryside rushed over with a red face and said that he wanted to rid her of the 4 pests, she could no longer endure. As a noble black frost dragon, she loved cleanliness, so how could she allow that man reeking of alcohol to approach her? That day she extended her hand just like tonight. Thus, that scholar surnamed Zhou died, transformed into a flower of blood. That flower of blood from several hundred years ago was even more beautiful than tonight's bloom. The scholar surnamed Zhou was even more thoroughly shattered, turning into powder that was blown away by the wind. Perhaps it was because she did not have these chains on her feet at the time. She thought to herself. In short, the scholar surnamed Zhou died. Later on, according to that wicked scholar surnamed Wang, he even appeared in the local county annals and became a hero praised by all the people. She expressed that she did not understand this, nor did she care. The people of that county later organized 10 volunteer armies to kill her, but she ended up killing many of them. The people of that county were all very disorderly, so presumably the annals were also written randomly. She thought to herself, but too many people really was very vexing. She had an extremely poor memory of this. When she sensed the countless people surrounding the Orthodox Academy tonight, Her first reaction was unease and then fear. She used a curtain hat to conceal her beautiful face and quickened her pace, wanting to enter the Orthodox Academy as quickly as possible, but she was still discovered by someone at the entrance of 100 Flowers Lane. The assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets had sneaked out of the snowstorm and wanted to kill her. This assassin did not have much of a scent, compared to that scholar surnamed Zhou from several hundred years ago, but as a noble black frost dragon, when offended, she naturally had to make a response befitting of her status. This response was even faster than her ability to think. It was to have the assassin die. The assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets exploded into blood and flesh that fell to the snowy ground. She felt a lot more comfortable, and the fear she felt towards the crowd in the depths of her heart faded a lot. Accompanied by this, the ruthlessness in her heart gradually increased. Following that, she killed another 2 human powerhouses. As the blood splashed and death approached, all of her fear and uneasiness disappeared. Her violent emotions triggered her bloodthirsty instincts. She instinctively licked the blood at the corner of her lip. She thought it would be sweet and delicious, but who knew it would be so filthy and stinky? Was it because the yuan qi on the continent was thin that humans became much more unpalatable? Or could it be the food that Chen Chongqing sent over in the past few years was too rich, which made him picky? As she thought of this, she couldn't help but feel nauseous and vomit. This situation made her very angry, making her feel a lot of resentment towards the weak humans and Chen Chongqing, who might be harboring evil intentions. She began to lose her temper. Like a wronged child, she kept stamping her feet, scaring away the wind and snow, cracking the ground, and scaring the whole world. The wind and snow rose once more as she walked towards the Orthodox Academy. Her body was not very large. On the contrary, it was rather petite, but as she approached, the space in 100 Flowers Lane began to faintly deform as if it was about to burst. Blood seeped out of the darkness, perhaps from assassins who had not been able to escape in time or soldiers who had been knocked unconscious. The experts of the imperial court that had fled far away sensed that terrifying qi growing more and more real, that powerful pressure seemingly about to materialize. Xiao De's complexion was even uglier, so pale that it was devoid of blood. His sensitivity to this aura was far greater than that of a human expert. This qi was clearly not completely mature, but it seemed to originate from the most primordial wilderness, imbued with an ancient and leisurely aura. To humans, this qi was powerful and terrifying, but to demi-humans, this qi directly crushed down on their souls, making it impossible for them to even think of resisting or have the courage to do so. Xiao De's body incessantly trembled. Logically speaking, even if he was no match for this black-clothed girl, he should at least be able to slow her down a little. Yet no matter how he mobilized his true essence, strengthened his will, or even went berserk, he could not gather enough courage. He did not even dare to take a single step forward. This innate pressure between living beings was truly too terrifying. The fact that he could still remain in the lane, still stand, not kneel in the snow, was proof of his strength and pride. But this was still far from enough. The black-clothed girl noticed the existence of this demi-human and turned her head to glance at him, somewhat interested. Under her gaze, Xiao De's soul seemed to be scorched by sacred flames. Fear surged out of his eyes, and he no longer dared to linger. He suddenly turned and vanished into the darkness. Not long after Xiao De vanished, a leisurely sigh came from the darkness. A hint of wariness appeared on the black-clothed girl's face. Nothing happened. After that sigh, there was no other sound. On the Bridge of Helplessness, some 14 li from this place, the demi-human empress, Madame Mu, boarded a carriage pulled by a 7-colored deer and began to drive out of the capital. On the snowy shore of the Orthodox Academy, Shang Xingzhou turned to look in the direction of the Bridge of Helplessness. He slightly arched his brows in surprise. The departure of Madame Mu and the demi-human diplomatic mission meant that from this moment onwards, White Emperor City would maintain its neutrality between the Great Zhou imperial court and the orthodoxy. Why had there been such a large change? It had to be known that this was highly likely to alter the situation of the entire continent. It was naturally because of that black-clothed girl who had arrived against the wind and snow. Unlike the proud and aloof heavenly phoenix, the dragon race had written far too many stories on the continent. To the demi-humans, the dragon race, which had not appeared in the world for a very long time, was still their deeply rooted belief, their spiritual sustenance. Moreover, it was said that the demi-humans on the two shores of the Red River had a very close relationship with the black frost dragons that allowed them to establish their country. The walls of the Orthodox Academy were broken and the black-clothed girl walked in. Some blue-clothed Taoists stood in the snow, forming a seemingly messy but actually almost perfect formation. She could sense the strength of these humans, and then she saw the middle-aged Taoist on the other side of the lake. She had been imprisoned at the bottom of the well of New North Bridge for several centuries, but she had still seen many human experts, like Wang Jitze, Qin Zhong, the Tianhai Divine Empress, the Pope, and Su Li. But in reality, she was only afraid of Su Li and Tianhai, because these two truly did dare to kill her. Now, there was one more human that made her feel a faint fear. She was somewhat nervous, but she did not stop walking. She walked across the lake and came to Chen Chongqing's side. She cleared her throat and said, "Hello, I am your protector." Chapter 736. Before speaking, she first cleared her throat. She appeared very calm, even playful like a child. But Shang Xingzhou and Chen Chongqing could both hear the slight tremble in her voice. It was not because she was excited to meet Chen Chongqing with her free body, but because she was uneasy. She felt that she was too close to the middle-aged Taoist, somewhat dangerous. At this moment, she still did not know that this person was Chen Chongqing's master, but she could clearly sense that he had the ability to harm or even kill her. There were very few human experts in the world that had the ability to harm or even kill her, but tonight, just as she had escaped her imprisonment of several hundred years, she had encountered one. This made her feel a sense of defeat as if she was facing her fate, so much so that she did not dare to glance at Shang Xingzhou. She only stared into Chen Chongqing's eyes, seeming especially serious and focused. She had no idea that in Shang Xingzhou's eyes, she was also an extremely dangerous existence. The records of the humans in the Taoist canon clearly stated that one could never be too wary of the dragon race, the highest level of creatures under the starry sky. Moreover, she was a black frost dragon with the noblest and strongest bloodline of the dragon race. Her petite body was brimming with energy that countless human experts dreamed of but could never possess. If she learned to use that energy, or if that energy were to just passively explode, it would assuredly create a terrifying momentum and bitter consequences. She feared Shang Xingzhou, and Shang Xingzhou was wary of her. Chen Chongqing was only very shocked. He had not expected that she had actually escaped from the bottom of the well. Even if he and Su Yorong had used the correct method, his blood, driven by the sublimation of the scripture of flowing west, was constantly being corroded by time. Based on his calculations, it would still take at least 2 years for the chain to snap. Moreover, after leaving the underground world, why had she not hurriedly left this continent brimming with the aura of humans that she disliked the most and returned to the warm archipelago in the south? Why had she come to the Orthodox Academy? There were many variables in this negotiation, and they were faintly advantageous to him, but Chen Chongqing was not happy. He did not want anyone or anything other than himself to participate in this negotiation, whether it was the priests of the Li Palace, the teachers and students of the Orthodox Academy, Mount Li and Scholatry Manor, or his worried senior brother in the Dark Palace. And what did she mean by those words? Protector? Chen Chongqing recalled the relevant records in the 7th book of the Taoist canon, the Covenant of Dawn, and then he recalled a few matters of the past that the Pope had seemingly inadvertently mentioned that night. Whether it was the orthodoxy or the Taoist faith of the past, if they wanted to preserve their Taoist orthodoxy that would never change for 10,000 generations, they would inevitably place great importance on their inheritances. The current pope would often begin his plans many years in advance, educating and raising his disciples. Those young disciples possessed incredible talent in cultivation and astonishing potential, but if they wanted to grow into true experts capable of leading the Taoist sect forward, they still needed a very long time and many trials. Moreover, the number of orthodox disciples of the Taoist sect had always been very small. For example, in the previous generation there was only the Pope and Shang Xingzhou. In this generation, there was only Yuan Chen Chongsheng and Shang Xingzhou, who had used some unknown method to confirm his identity, Mu Jiushi. With such a long and arduous journey of cultivation and such a small number of successors, logically speaking, the inheritance of the Tao sect could be cut off at any time. However, for countless years, Taoism had been passed down for countless generations, and such a situation had never occurred. Apart from the fact that those successors were as amazing as Yin and Shang, there was another very important reason. When these young successors traveled the world to cultivate, Taoism would often invite an extremely powerful or extremely influential senior to be that successor's guardian. The Taoist orthodoxy had existed for tens of thousands of years, and this rule had also been maintained for many generations, even longer than the Great Zhou dynasty. If Chen Chongsheng had lived in Xining Village's old temple as a legitimate disciple of the orthodoxy, then he truly should have had a guardian, and that guardian would assuredly be one of the few experts of the continent, most likely one of the storms of the 8 directions. But at the time, no one on the continent knew of his identity. Now that he was the Pope, did he still need a guardian? And why was it her? So the person Yin spoke of was you. Shang Xingzhou's expression was calm, not at all surprised. It was obvious that he had already known of this matter. He looked at the little black dragon and said, "After several hundred years, you can finally leave that old well of New North Bridge and regain your freedom. Why don't you return to the Southern Sea?" "Because this is my promise." The little black dragon stood in front of Chen Chongsheng and solemnly said. It was obvious that Shang Xingzhou had placed an enormous pressure on her. Her small face was filled with nervousness, but it was still determined. Shang Xingzhou suddenly asked, "Will you protect him?" She raised her face and proudly said, "Of course." Shang Xingzhou continued, "Are you willing to become one with him before the starry sky, to love him, to respect him, to comfort him, to love him as if he were yourself, to always place his name before your own in sickness and health, in wealth and poverty, in success and failure, all the way until you leave this world and return to the sea of stars?" These words were like a cool breeze, slowly arriving, but also like a clap of thunder, rumbling without end. This was one of the most ancient words in the scriptures of the Church. This was the oath of a guardian, this was a rule of the Li Palace. After a moment of silence, she said, "I am willing." Shang Xingzhou asked, "Even if you have to give up your life?" Without the slightest hesitation, she answered, "Yes." Several years ago at the bottom of New North Bridge, she had already given up something more important than her life for Chen Chongsheng, at least in her view. Of course, this did not mean that she was truly willing to die for Chen Chongsheng without any conditions, nor did it mean that she was not afraid of death. As members of the dragon race with their long lives, death was something they rarely considered, but it was precisely because their lives were so long that when they occasionally thought of it, they would feel a fear that far surpassed that of ordinary humans. She stared into Shang Xingzhou's eyes and said, "Not even Wang Ji-su dared to kill me back then, only to imprison me. I don't believe that you would dare to kill me." In the common understanding of the cultivation world, the dragon race was often immortal. The main reason for this impression that went against the truth was that the dragon race was the highest level of life below the starry sky. They possessed an incomparably long lifespan and unimaginably powerful strength. Moreover, countless years ago, when the dragon race withdrew from the continent, they formed a pact with the other worlds, Any life form that offended the dragon race must die. The main reason that this pact had been passed down to this day was not because the demon race or the human race attached great importance to this promise, but because the dragon race was powerful. Whether it was the peak experts of the demon race or the human race, even if they were facing a lone or even weak dragon, they would rarely try to do anything. This was because every dragon had a soul pearl in its body. Once the dragon was killed, the soul pearl would shatter, and its clansmen in the distant south would sense it and carry out a frenzied vengeance. Not even the great Zhou dynasty ruled by Emperor Taizong was willing to pay this price. When the little black dragon wreaked havoc everywhere, Wang Zhisu had used a scheme to capture her, but he had never killed her. Besides her being forgivable, an even more important reason was that she was not easy to kill and was not easy to kill. These two words of "not easy to kill" naturally had different meanings. For countless years, the dragon race had always been an object of reverence, far from the continent. But at certain moments in history, a few accidents would occasionally occur. Chapter 737. This so-called accident was because a few human or demon experts had appeared on the continent at the time. Those experts were far too powerful, so powerful that they were somewhat excessive. They even surprised the entire world, and did not place the dragon race in their eyes at all. For example, the legendary Grand Scholar Tungus of the demon race was especially fond of using dragon blood to conduct research. In his long and dull life, countless dragons had died in that laboratory in Shuelao City that could not see the sun but was always aimed at the moon. Some of the weaker black frost dragons would even drop out of the sky in fright upon hearing his name. Another example was the previous master of the mountain sea sword, who had once engaged in vicious battles with several evil dragons in the mountains and seas. It was said that the sea that had been dyed red later on produced particularly precious sea cucumbers. Another example was the strongest black frost dragon in the past 1,000 years that obtained the friendship of the demon lord in Shuelao City was ultimately transformed by Zhou Dufu into that mountain range in the garden of Zhou. Another example was that person called Su Li. Back in the snowy hot springs, when the little black dragon first laid eyes on Su Li, she had almost been scared to death. She could clearly sense that this person had once killed many dragons. Those who dared to slay dragons were not necessarily true warriors, because they could fail. Only those who succeeded in slaying dragons could be called powerful. Then what did someone like Su Li, who had made a special trip to the distant southern sea to ascertain just how powerful the dragon race was and had slain countless dragons with his sword? Fine, he had always been an indescribable accident, an exception that bordered on madness. He could not be judged by common sense. The little black dragon did not know who Shang Xingzhou was, but she could sense that this powerful Taoist priest was also an accident, so she had purposely mentioned that matter of the past. In her view, even if the vicious reputation of the dragon race could not frighten him into retreating, the mention of a legendary name like Wang Zhizi should at least make him feel deep veneration. Shang Xingzhou's response was very calm and indifferent, completely beyond her expectations. The rumors say that you have a very cruel personality, often eating people at the slightest disagreement. After you came ashore from the south, countless villages and cities were turned into ruins by you. He calmly looked at her, like an elder looking at a naughty child. He indifferently said, "But when I saw you in the Frost Flower Shop, I knew that the rumors were not true." The Frost Flower Shop was a very obscure place in the capital. Chen Chongqing knew it because Mo Yan's orange garden was there. Ordinary people would find it very difficult to remember. But how could the little black dragon forget? Hundreds of years ago, she was captured by the experts of the imperial court of the great Zhou dynasty. She lay powerlessly on the ground, gasping for breath. The surface of the bridge was covered with a thin layer of frost. That damned scholar surnamed Wang walked over from the other end of the bridge. The footprints he left behind were like blooming flowers. That was how the Frost Flower Shop got its name. Back then you saw me? The little black dragon looked at Shang Xingzhou, the unease and fear in her heart transforming into an intense wariness. Of course I've seen you before. The chains that Wang Jitze used to bind you were borrowed from me. Shang Xingzhou looked down at her feet. Between her feet was a chain that looked a little short, but was actually very long. It formed a sharp contrast with the white snow. She stepped barefoot on the snow-covered grass as if she couldn't feel the cold, but when she heard Shang Xingzhou's words, she felt cold. Shang Xingzhou continued, "This chain is a treasure of the Li Palace. Junior brother was able to pull it out of the wall, but he couldn't break it." The little black dragon and Chen Chongqing silently glanced at each other. It was said that time was the most powerful and history the heaviest, and all this heaviest strength was contained in Shang Xingzhou's words. The Elder of Heavenly Secrets had passed away, the Pope had returned to the Sea of Stars, the Demon Lord had fallen into the abyss, and Wang Jitze had secluded himself from the world. There was no one left who had the right to speak to him about the past. From this perspective, history was time. It was just that in those past years, he had not written down his name. My companions and comrades have died one after another, and there's still one hiding in the mountains like a ghost, so I can no longer continue to hide. Shang Xingzhou looked at the two of them, feeling rather emotional as if he was thinking of some story from long ago. He leisurely said, "Because we are both protectors." Chen Chongqing understood what he meant. No matter how much mutual deception and cruel schemes there were, no one could deny that at the very beginning, Emperor Taizong and the ministers of the Lingyan Pavilion were a group of complete idealists. They had thrown away their heads and spilled their blood in order to put an end to the chaos of the world, to expel the demons, and to become the protectors of the continent. Shang Xingzhou was not only a witness to that magnificent era, but also a person who had personally experienced it. He had always been one of these idealists. His reputation was not prominent, but he played an extremely important role. Emperor Taizu had allied with the current pope. Emperor Taizong had ultimately obtained the full support of the Li Palace in the coup of the 100 Herb Garden, and those cruel stories related to the Lingyan Pavilion. Presumably, they all had something to do with him. Those comrades and companions of the past had either died, been killed by Emperor Taizong and him, or left. In short, after a long 1,000 years, he was the only one left. Even if he was the only one left, it was precisely because he was the only one left that he naturally had to shoulder the fates and responsibilities of his companions. He wanted to become the protector of the continent. He wanted to carry out Emperor Taizong's final decree. He wanted to realize the ideals of his companions. The human race would be unified, the demon race would bow their heads, and the world would be united for thousands of generations. No one can stop me, and no one should stop me, including you, Shang Xingzhou calmly and firmly said to Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing didn't know what to say. At this moment, the cry of a crane resounded through the night sky. A white crane had returned from the south and answered in his place. A gentle wind blew. It was very cold to ordinary people, but to the 2 people and 1 dragon beneath the great banyan tree, it could only be considered cool and refreshing. The snow on the lake rustled in the wind like withered leaves that had long ago been buried at the bottom of the snow. The starless night was not cold, nor was it dark, because no matter how the court changed, the lights of the 10,000 households of the capital would always illuminate the world. It had already been countless years. The white crane had brought with it a letter from Su Yorong, expressing Holy Maiden Peak's fearless stance. Madame Mu left in her dear carriage, expressing White Emperor City's stance. The stances of Mount Li and Scolatry Manor did not need to be asked. As for the most crucial orthodoxy, even if many people were willing to support Shang Xingzhou, in front of the Pope's final decree, who would dare to openly oppose him? After a somewhat oppressive silence, Shang Xingzhou spoke once more. "When I picked you up by the stream, I once said that your fate was very bad." He looked at Chen Chongqing and said, "Now it seems that I was wrong. The young Taoist from Xining village had now become the youngest pope in all of history. In his mother's womb, his sun wheel had been destroyed, so he should not have lived past 20. But now, his meridians had been rebuilt, his star openings perfect, and his path of cultivation was smooth and level. He had the support of the entire orthodoxy, the support of many factions, and even a protector. Anyone could see that his fate was very good and worthy of praise. And then? Chapter 738. In the past, Chen Chongqing's fate was very bad, but later on, his fate was very good. To put it another way, his fate had been changed. On that night at the peak of the Mausoleum of Books, the Tianhai Divine Empress had defied the heavens and changed his fate. From that moment on, his path of cultivation was smooth. The shadow that had hung over his head for 10-some years vanished, leaving only light. Of course, as his fate and status changed, he encountered some new trials that he could never have imagined back then. Even with the divine staff in hand, becoming master of the orthodoxy was still extremely difficult. Fortunately, the Pope had already made many arrangements for him upon his return to the Sea of Stars, already smoothing out the road ahead as much as possible. From a certain perspective, the Pope had also changed his fate. In order to place this mighty legacy in Chen Chongqing's hands, the Pope had made an extremely meticulous and appropriate design. Putting aside the rainbow in the Li Palace or the figure that had vanished from the prayer mat in the Orange Garden, just the starlight in the well of New North Bridge, and the 3 green leaves on the stone wall were enough to show his painstaking care. The Pope had chosen the little black dragon to be Chen Chongqing's protector naturally because she was sufficiently powerful. Besides experts of the divine domain, there were few people on the continent that could defeat her. However, an even more important reason was still her identity. She was the princess of the Black Frost Dragon tribe that had helped the demi-human race establish their kingdom countless years ago. The White Emperor couple had probably known a long time ago that a Black Frost Dragon had been imprisoned near the imperial city by the humans, but they had never expressed any opinion on this matter. Perhaps it was because it had been too long ago, or perhaps it was because the so-called sentiment could never rival value. The Pope did not care about this and directly rescued her, forcing White Emperor City to accept this favor. Even if the White Emperor couple wanted to pretend to be deaf and mute, the tribes and elders on the 2 shores of the Red River would not agree. The Pope had always conducted himself like the bright moon and cool wind. In his entire life, he had never played with any schemes, but he had still lived in this world for 1,000 years and had a deep understanding of human nature. There was no difference between the demi-human race and the human race in this aspect. He had calculated correctly. The little black dragon left the well of New North Bridge and walked through the snowstorm to the Orthodox Academy. Madame Mu sighed and rode the 7-colored deer carriage out of the capital. Even now, Chen Chongqing still could not completely understand the Pope's painstaking care. He was too young. Even though he was well-read in the Taoist canon and remembered many legends and stories, he found it very difficult to connect them to the present. Therefore, after hearing Shang Xingzhou's next few words, he was still stunned for a long time before he understood the meaning behind it. "Do you know who Yin's protector was?" "I don't know." Chen Xuanba. This was an answer that no one would have thought of. Over the past 1,000 years, there were only 2 names that shined the brightest on this continent. One was Zhou Dufu, the other was Emperor Taizong. But before Chen Xuanba died, no one dared to say that Zhou Dufu and Emperor Taizong could dominate this world. Compared to the long river of history in the past 10 years, which seemed abnormally short, he had been able to compete with these 2 people in different fields. Each of them was outstanding, dazzling, and brilliant. Such a person could be said to be unparalleled in the world. Even if the Pope had been a legitimate successor of the Taoist faith, logically speaking, he still did not have the right to have such an extraordinary hegemon act as his protector. Unless there was something hidden in this matter. Chen Xuanba should be your ancestor. It's even possible that you are the essence blood he left in this world to rebuild yourself. Thus, Yin is repaying his debt. Shang Xingzhou asked, "Do you understand his meaning now?" Chen Chongqing was quiet for a very long time, then nodded his head. The Pope's love and pity could come from many places, like repaying a debt, or feeling guilty, or a promise. In this aspect, he had not thought too deeply about it, but he had always understood the meaning behind the Pope's arrangements. His master did not like him and wanted him dead, but this did not mean that he also wanted him dead. This also meant that he and Shang Xingzhou did not necessarily have to fight to the death. If he continued to stay in the capital, he would assuredly become a source of unrest, unless he decided to lead the orthodoxy in war against the imperial court. He naturally would not do this, because he could not find any reason. Did he want to seize his senior brother's imperial throne? As for Sin, he was well aware that Shang Xingzhou had enough confidence in this aspect to answer his questions. The imperial court had just been established, so even if he wanted to do evil, he still did not have the chance. The ugly Sin currently lay with Zhou Tong, and regardless of Chen Chongqing's emotional inclinations, Zhou Tong's sin should be placed more on the Tianhai Divine Empress. Chen Chongqing turned to Shang Xingzhou and asked, "And sir? Does sir understand martial uncle's meaning?" Shang Xingzhou said nothing. After that long night of conversation and today, when he saw the little dragon walk out of the snowstorm, he completely understood Yin's meaning. Just when did longevity become an obstacle in his heart? Perhaps it should also be calculated from that night in the mausoleum of books? That year, when he had picked up, or received, the infant in the wooden basin by the stream, he had lamented that his fate was not good, because he already knew of his fate. Before Chen Chongqing was born, his sun wheel had collapsed, and then the people of the other continent had poured an unimaginable amount of sacred light into his body. It was impossible for him to live past the age of 20. When he said to Chen Chongqing that he would defy the heavens and change his fate, he had naturally been deceiving him. He had never imagined that Chen Chongqing could successfully defy the heavens and change his fate. No matter how astonishing his talent was, after leaving Xining village, he was still only a few years away from the age of 20. Even if Zhou Dufu were reborn and Wang Jitsu were corrupted, how could they possibly accomplish such a feat? Reality proved that his view was correct. Even after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, Chen Chongqing was still unable to defy the heavens and change his fate, not even a sliver of hope. He believed that Chen Chongqing would die, be eaten by Tianhai, or die of old age, but who could have imagined that Tianhai would surpass everyone's expectations and make such a choice? If this was a game of chess that he had arranged, then Tianhai's death would be the decisive move. He believed that he had already obtained victory in this game, but when he looked at the chessboard, he was shocked to discover that a chess piece that should have been dead was still perfectly fine on the chessboard. The chess piece that should have been dead was still alive, and the seemingly uninteresting endgame instantly began to undergo countless changes. This chess piece on the chessboard seemed to have already transcended the boundaries of the chessboard. This made Shang Xingzhou feel extremely uneasy and wary. Thus, on the divine path in the morning sun, he made a decision. He wanted Chen Chongqing to die as quickly as possible, wanted this chess piece to disappear as quickly as possible. So on the divine path, he did not even glance at Chen Chongqing. Thus, there were so many things that happened afterwards. It was only after that long night of conversation that he vaguely understood. Because of the relationship between this chess piece and him, because of the Tao that he cultivated, he had placed too much importance on this chess piece and had used up too much of his energy. Yin had spoken correctly. Since they hated each other, meeting was better than not seeing each other. Shang Xingzhou turned and walked out of the Orthodox Academy. Just like that time on the divine path of the Mausoleum of Books, he did not glance at Chen Chongqing again. The tensome blue-clothed Taoists followed him out. All of this had happened too suddenly, without the slightest warning. Just then, a voice rang out in Chen Chongqing's sea of consciousness without the slightest warning. Go a little further. Don't let the capital see. Don't let the world see. Don't let me see. Chapter 739. It was Shang Xingzhou's voice. Don't let the capital see, don't let the world see, don't let him see, what if he saw? Everyone knew that the unspoken words must have something to do with death. Chen Chongqing didn't say anything. He looked at the night sky and the wind and snow. His eyes were bright and calm. In his heart there was a saying that had to do with returning. The snowstorm in the night did not become stronger, nor did it become lighter. The countless cavalrymen around the Tradition Academy were still vigilantly facing off against each other. When Shang Xingzhou returned to the palace, the green-robed Taoists bowed respectfully and left. He stood in the wind and snow and looked at the young emperor's silhouette cut by the light in the side window of the main hall. He had a gratified expression. Everything was worth it in the end. There was a rustling sound in the snow. It was the sound of boots stepping on the soft snow. Priest Xian came up behind him and said something in a low voice. He seemed especially humble. After Mei Lisha returned to the Sea of Stars, the Bureau of Ecclesiastic Education never welcomed a new master. This church had a very special position in the orthodoxy, and its hidden strength was extremely powerful. Even Mao Chuyu found it inconvenient to act as its guardian, so he could only temporarily act as its guardian for a few months. In the eyes of many people, Priest Xian, who was deeply trusted by Mei Lisha and had a close relationship with the Orthodox Academy, was the one most likely to be in charge of the Bureau of Ecclesiastic Education. It was just that his seniority was a little lacking. No one knew that Priest Xian actually had another identity. He was a secret agent of the Department for Purging Officials, and no one knew that a few days ago, when Zhou Tong was being pursued, the person who had pulled out the zither strings of Zhou Prison's underground array and forced Zhou Tong out was also him. The reason was very simple. Priest Xian, who had a bright future ahead of him, could not possibly be willing to continue being Zhou Tong's dog. He hoped that Zhou Tong would die. Of course, if he hadn't received some sort of promise or guarantee, his courage would have come a little later. The capital will be fine for now, and the Li Palace will be fine for 3 years. There's not much meaning in you guarding the Bureau of Ecclesiastic Education. Shang Xingzhou said, Go to the south for me and see the situation at Holy Maiden Peak and Mount Li. In addition, tell the longevity sect to deliver that item I want. Priest Xian was a bit shocked. He didn't know what the longevity sect wanted to give to the venerable Taoist, but he didn't say anything. He accepted the order and quickly disappeared into the wind and snow. The snow on the surface of the lake had been swept away by the cold wind, revealing a smooth surface of ice. Reflecting the lights in the distance, it looked like a large piece of colored glass. There were some small dots on top of the glass, which were the footprints she had left behind earlier. Perhaps it was because seeing the lake frozen into glass, Chen Chongqing thought of something very important to her. Did you bring the luminous pearls and treasures with you? In the underground cavern at the bottom of New North Bridge's well, the stone walls were inlaid with over 1,000 incomparably rare night pearls, and the ground was piled with mountains of gold and silver. These were the little black dragon's treasures, the greatest source of mental energy that had allowed her to endure for several hundred years. Chen Chongqing clearly knew how important these things were to her, so he reminded her. Of course I did. The little black dragon patted its belly, its heroic spirit reaching the clouds. It was like a man who had just drunk 80 bowls of strong wine. In human form, she was very petite, 2 heads shorter than Chen Chongqing. She looked like a little girl of 11 or 12, so this action was unavoidably rather comical. Of course, it was also very cute. Chen Chongqing knew that her black clothes were dragon scales. They could not be separated, nor could they store too many things. Moreover, she did not have a spatial artifact, so he couldn't help but be very curious as to where she had hidden those things. You really are stupid to death. The little black dragon was rather angry. Patting its belly, it said, I already said it was here. Only now did Chen Chongqing notice that her belly was slightly bulging, just like a gluttonous child. As it turned out, she had actually swallowed those thousand-some luminous pearls and the unimaginable amount of gold and silver and coral into her belly. In the next few years, he wouldn't have to worry about not having enough money to use, but did he have to make her spit it out every time he used it? Chen Chongqing felt that this was rather unclean, and then he very naturally realized that there was another way besides spitting it out. He instantly felt uneasy. Don't let your imagination run wild. The little black dragon very quickly reacted and roared, If you dare let your imagination run wild again, I'll swallow you in one gulp. Chen Chongqing thought to himself, if you really do swallow me, you'll still have to spit it out in the end, or something like that. His complexion grew even more unsightly. The little black dragon still very quickly understood. Her complexion was even more unsightly than his as she slowly raised her fist. This fist was very delicate. In the snowstorm, it seemed like a lonely plum blossom, truly pitiful. Boom! A peal of thunder boomed through the Orthodox Academy. The ground quaked and the snow on the great banyan tree rustled down. Several cracks appeared on the surface of the lake, and where the cracks intersected was the surface of the water. In the floating shards of ice, one could faintly make out a person. She grabbed that person and carried him back to the library. Due to the need to protect the books, the lamps and candles in the library were all specially made, so their temperature was relatively low. No matter how many lamps there were, no matter how long they were, it was still very difficult to dry the soaked clothes. Chen Chongqing sat amidst several dozen lamps, the cold water of the lake incessantly flowing onto the pitch-black floor. To be thrown into the frozen lake with a single punch, his entire body soaked and the cold biting into his bones, no matter how one looked at it, this was a very sorrowful matter, one very worthy of anger. He did not feel these emotions, because his body that had undergone perfect purification could endure this sort of heavy blow. After reaching perfect star condensation, the ordinary cold and heat of the world were simply incapable of assaulting his body and mind. Of course, the primary reason was that she was currently acting rather strangely. Based on her personality, the black-clothed girl that should have been proud of herself was now sitting across from him, her head lowered in dejection, even faintly sorrowful. What's wrong? My strength has decreased. Perhaps it's because I just escaped and still haven't gotten used to it. No. She looked at the chain tied to her ankle and said, If I can't cut this chain, I'll never be able to defeat your master. Chen Chongqing finally understood that this was what she was worried about and comforted her. Even if you cut this chain, you still won't be able to defeat him. She was very angry, yelling, Are you trying to comfort someone? Chen Chongqing earnestly replied, Yes, because this is an objective fact. When I was a child, a golden dragon wanted to eat me, but it was driven away by my master. In the dragon race, the golden dragon and the black frost dragons were the noblest and most powerful. Countless years ago, when the golden dragon race left the continent, the black frost dragons reigned supreme. The golden dragon he spoke of, according to Senior Yuren's later description, was probably a member of the golden dragon race, and it was highly likely to have been a member of the true imperial clan. That golden dragon was naturally countless times stronger than the current black dragon, but it was still not a match for his master. In his view, there was truly no need for the little black dragon to be sad over not being able to defeat his master. Who would be sad over not being able to chase after the sun? Who would? Of course, it was those brave, or perhaps crazy, sun chasers. Her gaze fell on the dagger at his waist. The first time she saw this dagger, she had sensed a vast, familiar chi that was worthy of reverence or vigilance. Later on, when she heard Chen Chongqing speak of the events of the past, she confirmed that this dagger was the third whisker of the golden dragon. To be able to defeat a member of the Golden Dragon Imperial clan and even take its most precious third whisker and use it as a weapon, just how powerful and confident must that person be? From that moment on, she knew that Chen Chongqing's master was a very frightening human. If possible, she naturally would not make an enemy of this human, but from today onwards I am your protector. That powerful human wants to kill you, so I naturally have to think of a way to defeat him and then kill him. So I'm a little sad. Chapter 740. Sadness was just an emotion, not despair. The black dragon lowered its head and gazed at the footprints in the snow, quickly beginning to think and calculate. Back then, when the golden colossal dragon imperial family returned from the foreign continent and broke through the crystal wall, how much power did they lose? Shang Xingzhou was able to defeat it easily because he had the home advantage, and he must have made preparations in advance. How could he accurately judge this person's true realm through this battle? If his chains were unlocked, how many chances would he have of defeating this person? Chen Chongqing guessed what she was thinking and said, "Don't think about it anymore." The little black dragon raised her head and stared into his eyes. "The Pope has made me your protector, so there must be some meaning behind it." Neither she nor Chen Chongqing knew that the Pope had rescued her from New North Bridge and made her protector primarily because of the complicated relationship between the Black Frost Dragon tribe and White Emperor City. Hearing the term guardian again, Chen Chongqing was silent for a while, then suddenly said, "Do you know who my master's guardian was?" The black dragon shook her head. Chen Chongqing looked at the direction where the man just disappeared in the wind and snow and said, "That night, Marshal Uncle told me. Master didn't choose a guardian." A strange light flashed through the little black dragon's eyes. Chen Chongqing continued, "Master believes that cultivating the Tao cannot rely on external objects, nor can he rely on others. Only relying on himself is enough." The black dragon said nothing. Such a person was too terrifying. Dawn came after the night. Wind and snow still enveloped the capital, and the continent welcomed a new year. Many important events occurred on the first day of the new year. For example, the Great Zhou dynasty officially changed its era name, and the Li Palace welcomed a new master. At the Li Palace's New Year's ceremony, something happened that shocked the entire continent. According to the will left behind by the Pope and the announcement of the orthodoxy, which had already been announced to the world in advance, Chen Chongqing became the new Pope. However, he did not appear at the New Year ceremony. His figure could not be seen in the Light Palace. Naturally, there was no so-called coronation ceremony. This news gave rise to countless shocked discussions. Whether it was the priests of the Li Palace, the teachers and students of the Ivy Academies, or the common people of the capital, they all felt extremely perplexed, and then very uneasy. Amidst the confusion, the Li Palace gave an authoritative explanation. The notice had the blood seals of the 5 leaders and Chen Chongqing's personal signature. Because the Pope was too young and had not cultivated for long enough, he decided to enter the world to cultivate and comprehend the heavenly Tao in the world of mortals. "When will you be back?" No one knew, and there was no answer in the bulletin. It was clearly written that the Pope could return to the capital at any time to ascend the throne. The Pope was not in the Li Palace, but had concealed his identity and secluded himself in the world? This was the first time something like this had happened in history. Shock and confusion filled the entire capital and even the entire continent, so much so that many people did not remember what the new era name of the Great Zhou dynasty was. When these emotions were finally somewhat diluted by time, people looked back at the year that had just passed and thought back to what the previous pope had done. Only then did they vaguely understand something. All of this had been arranged by the previous pope. If Chen Chongqing stayed in the capital, it would make the imperial court feel extremely uneasy. This kind of uneasiness would inevitably lead to the outbreak of war. His departure from Jingdo would make the court, more accurately, it would make Shang Xingzhou feel much more at ease. Even now, only a few people understood why Shang Xingzhou would be so wary of, reject, and loathe Chen Chongqing's existence. Just as Chen Chongqing had understood long ago, just as Shang Xingzhou had sighed last night in the snowstorm of the Orthodox Academy, if they hated each other, they would not meet. Give this master and disciple some time, some distance. Give the imperial court and the orthodoxy some time, some distance. Give the world and its people a chance. It did not need to be a war, did not need to be decided in a moment of life and death. Chen Chongqing was still the Pope. But he could not stay in the capital, could not stay in the Li Palace. Even if this endgame would ultimately end in a battle to the death, there would at least be some leeway to place a chess piece. Problems that could not be resolved now could be resolved in the future, perhaps when both sides possessed even more wisdom. This was the previous Pope's arrangement, and now it seemed that it was also the best method of resolving the problem. Of course, the previous Pope's arrangements had naturally included even more details, so that even if Chen Chongqing left the capital, the Li Palace could still maintain its stance. This never-before-seen situation, with its extremely complex causes and conditions, was a perfect manifestation of the Pope's wisdom and patience. As the successor, what Chen Chongqing needed to do now was to accept this arrangement and continue to increase his wisdom and patience, as well as his strength. He needed to rely on his wisdom and patience to survive. As long as he lived, he was the Pope. Once the mountain flowers bloomed, they could talk about it again. Not everyone could understand this matter, and even fewer people could understand the painstaking thought that had gone into the previous Pope's arrangements, as well as the resolve and boldness that the Li Palace had displayed through this matter. When their shock faded, they saw that the truth was very simple. Chen Chongqing had succeeded as Pope, but he had been driven out of the capital. Anyone could see this as a victory for the imperial court. Many people believed that Shang Xingzhou was unwilling to declare war on the orthodoxy, unwilling to reject the Pope's final decree, so he was making a gesture of leniency. Leniency was naturally condescension. A pope that was not in the Li Palace was only in name, no matter how one looked at it. It was even more dismal than being only in name. This was an exiled pope. The era of the Orthodox era had officially come to an end. The Tianhai Divine Empress's rule over the continent had become a page in the annals of history that had been turned over. The great Zhou dynasty had formally changed to a new country. The confluence of the north and south had been declared a success. When spring returned to the earth, countless matters would be put into practice. There were already many cultivators that had been decreed to come from the south to the north and join the various armies. The demon empress had been executed, the demon lord had been executed, Xuelao City had fallen into internal strife, the pope had passed away, and all things had changed. The future of the continent was bright. The human race would undoubtedly welcome the best era since Emperor Taizong. No one knew that on an ordinary and uneventful winter day, the new pope, Chen Chongqing, left the Orthodox Academy. He left 100 Flowers Lane, merged into the crowd, and walked along the Luo River. He crossed the Bridge of Helplessness and the stone pillars in front of the Li Palace, exited the city gate, and left the capital. He carried a letter in his bosom, a sword at his waist, and an umbrella in his hand. At his side was a girl dressed in black. The girl had a fresh and pleasant appearance, but her face was expressionless, making her seem particularly cold. In her bosom was a pot of green leaves. Chen Chongqing did not walk very fast, but the girl was very petite. If she wanted to keep up with him, she had to walk faster. As she walked, her black hair rose and fell in the cold wind. The green leaves in her bosom also rose and fell. These were not two oars swaying in the spring wind, but the appearance that she and the world should have. When I first wrote The Pope's Green Leaves, I had Lion in mind. I wanted to write this scene, so the little black dragon's name really should have been Matilda,